Paul said, "Please go on with your dinner. I believe Dr. Kynes was discussing water." "May we discuss it another time?" Kynes asked. "By all means," Paul said. And Jessica noted with pride her son's dignity, the mature sense of assurance. The banker picked up his water flagon, gestured with it at Butte. "None of us here can surpass Master Lingar Butte in flowery phrases. One might almost assume he aspired to great house status. Come, Master Butte, lead us in a toast. Perhaps you've a dollop of wisdom for the boy who must be treated like a man." Jessica clenched her right hand into a fist beneath the table. She saw a hand signal pass from Halleck to Idaho, saw the house troopers along the walls move into positions of maximum guard. Butte cast a venomous glare at the banker. Paul glanced at Halleck, took in the defensive positions of his guards, looked at the banker until the man lowered the water flagon. He said, "Once on Caladan, I saw the body of a drowned fisherman recovered. He—" "Drowned?" It was the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter. Paul hesitated, then— "Yes, immersed in water until dead. Drowned." "What an interesting way to die," she murmured. Paul's smile became brittle. He returned his attention to the banker. "The interesting thing about this man was the wounds on his shoulders, made by another fisherman's claw boots. This fisherman was one of several in a boat, a craft for travelling on water, that foundered, sank beneath the water. Another fisherman helping recover the body said he'd seen marks like this man's wounds several times. They meant another drowning fisherman had tried to stand on this poor fellow's shoulders in the attempt to reach up to the surface, to reach air." "Why is this interesting?" the banker asked. "Because of an observation made by my father at the time. He said the drowning man who climbs on your shoulders to save himself is understandable, except when you see it happen in the drawing-room." Paul hesitated just long enough for the banker to see the point coming. Then, "And, I should add, except when you see it at the dinner table." A sudden stillness enfolded the room. That was rash, Jessica thought. This banker might have enough rank to call my son out. She saw that Idaho was poised for instant action. The house troopers were alert. Gurney Halleck had his eyes on the men opposite him. "Ho, ho, ho!" It was the smuggler, Tuek, head thrown back, laughing with complete abandon. Nervous smiles appeared around the table. Butte was grinning. The banker had pushed his chair back, was glaring at Paul. Kynes said, "One baits an Atreides at his own risk." "Is it Atreides' custom to insult their guests?" the banker demanded. Before Paul could answer, Jessica leaned forward, said, "Sir," and she thought, "We must learn this Harkonnen creature's game. Is he here to try for Paul? Does he have help?" "My son displays a general garment, and you claim it's cut to your fit?" Jessica asked. "What a fascinating revelation." She slid a hand down to her leg, to the crysknife she had fastened in a calf sheath. The banker turned his glare on Jessica. Eyes shifted away from Paul, and she saw him ease himself back from the table, freeing himself for action. He had focused on the code word, garment. Prepare for violence. Kynes directed a speculative look at Jessica, gave a subtle hand signal to Tuek. The smuggler lurched to his feet, lifted his flagon. "I'll give you a toast," he said, "to young Paul Atreides, still a lad by his looks, but a man by his actions." "Why do they intrude?" Jessica asked herself. The banker stared now at Kynes, and Jessica saw terror return to the agent's face. People began responding all around the table. Where Kynes leads, people follow, Jessica thought. He has told us he sides with Paul. What's the secret of his power? It can't be because he's judge of the change. That's temporary, and certainly not because he's a civil servant. She removed her hand from the crysknife hilt, lifted her flagon to Kynes, who responded in kind. Only Paul and the banker Susu, what an idiotic nickname, Jessica thought, remained empty-handed. The banker's attention stayed fixed on Kynes. Paul stared at his plate. I was handling it correctly, Paul thought. Why do they interfere? He glanced covertly at the male guests nearest him. Prepare for violence? From whom? Certainly not from that banker fellow. Halleck stirred, spoke as though to no one in particular, directing his words over the heads of the guests across from him. In our society, people shouldn't be quick to take offence. It's frequently suicidal. He looked at the stillsuit manufacturer's daughter beside him. Don't you think so, miss?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed I do, she said. There's too much violence. It makes me sick. And lots of times no offence is meant, but people die anyway. It doesn't make sense.
Indeed it doesn't, Halleck said. Jessica saw the near perfection of the girl's act, realized that empty-headed little female is not an empty-headed little female. She saw then the pattern of the threat and understood that Halleck too had detected it. They had planned to lure Paul with sex. Jessica relaxed. Her son had probably been the first to see it. His training hadn't overlooked that obvious gambit. Kynes spoke to the banker. Isn't another apology in order? The banker turned a sickly grin toward Jessica, said, My lady, I fear I've overindulged in your wines. You serve potent drink at table, and I'm not accustomed to it. Jessica heard the venom beneath his tone, spoke sweetly. When strangers meet, great allowance should be made for differences of custom and training. Thank you, my lady, he said. The dark-haired companion of the stillsuit manufacturer leaned toward Jessica, said,
The Duke spoke of our being secure here. I do hope that doesn't mean more fighting.
She was directed to lead the conversation this way, Jessica thought. Likely this will prove unimportant, Jessica said, but there's so much detail requiring the Duke's personal attention in these times. As long as enmity continues between Atreides and Harkonnen, we cannot be too careful. The Duke has sworn Khanly. He will leave no Harkonnen agent alive on Arrakis, of course. She glanced at the Guild Bank agent, and the conventions naturally support him in this. She shifted her attention to Kynes. Is this not so, Dr. Kynes? Indeed it is, Kynes said. The stillsuit manufacturer pulled his companion gently back. She looked at him, said,
I do believe I'll eat something now. I'd like some of that bird dish you served earlier.
Jessica signalled a servant, turned to the banker. And you, sir, were speaking of birds earlier and of their habits. I find so many interesting things about Arrakis. Tell me, where is the spice found? Do the hunters go deep into the desert?
Oh, no, my lady, he said. Very little's known of the deep desert, and almost nothing of the southern regions.
There's a tale that a great mother-lode of spice is to be found in the southern reaches, Kynes said. But I suspect it was an imaginative invention, made solely for purposes of a song. Some daring spice hunters do, on occasion, penetrate into the edge of the central belt, but that's extremely dangerous. Navigation is uncertain. Storms are frequent. Casualties increase dramatically the farther you operate from shield wall bases. It hasn't been found profitable to venture too far south. Perhaps if we had a weather satellite— Butte looked up, spoke around a mouthful of food.
It said the Fremen travel there, that they go anywhere and have hunted out soaks and sipwells even in the southern latitudes.
Soaks and sipwells? Jessica asked. Kynes spoke quickly. Wild rumours, my lady. These are known on other planets, not on Arrakis. A soak is a place where water seeps to the surface, or near enough to the surface to be found by digging according to certain signs. A sip well is a form of soak, where a person draws water through a straw. So it is said. There's deception in his words, Jessica thought. Why is he lying? Paul wondered. How very interesting, Jessica said. And she thought, it is said. What a curious speech mannerism they have here. If they only knew what it reveals about their dependence on superstitions. I've heard you have a saying, Paul said, that polish comes from the cities, wisdom from the desert. "There are many sayings on Arrakis," Kynes said. Before Jessica could frame a new question, a servant bent over her with a note. She opened it, saw the Duke's handwriting and code signs, scanned it. "You'll all be delighted to know," she said, "that our Duke sends his reassurances. The matter which called him away has been settled. The missing carryall has been found. A Harkonnen agent in the crew overpowered the others and flew the machine to a smuggler's base, hoping to sell it there. Both man and machine were turned over to our forces." She nodded to Tuek. The smuggler nodded back. Jessica refolded the note, tucked it into her sleeve. "I'm glad it didn't come to open battle," the banker said. "The people have such hopes the Atreides will bring peace and prosperity." "Especially prosperity," Butte said. "Shall we have our dessert now?" Jessica asked. "I've had our chef prepare a Caladan sweet, pongy rice in sauce dulce."
"It sounds wonderful," the stillsuit manufacturer said. "Would it be possible to get the recipe?"
"Any recipe you desire," Jessica said, registering the man for later mention to Howard. The stillsuit manufacturer was a fearful little climber, and could be bought. Small talk resumed around her. "Such a lovely fabric."
"He's having a setting made to match the jewel."
"We might try for a production increase next quarter." Jessica stared down at her plate, thinking of the coded part of Leto's message. "The Harkonnens tried to get in a shipment of laser guns. We captured them. This may mean they've succeeded with other shipments. It certainly means they don't place much store in shields. Take appropriate precautions." Jessica focused her mind on laser guns, wondering. The white-hot beams of disruptive light could cut through any known substance, provided that substance was not shielded. The fact that feedback from a shield would explode both laser gun and shield did not bother the Harkonnens. Why? A laser gun shield explosion was a dangerous variable, could be more powerful than atomics, could kill only the gunner and his shielded target. The unknowns here filled her with uneasiness. Paul said, "I've never doubted we'd find the carryall. Once my father moves to solve a problem, he solves it. This is a fact the Harkonnens are beginning to discover." He's boasting, Jessica thought. He shouldn't boast. No person who'll be sleeping far below ground level this night as a precaution against laser guns has the right to boast.
There is no escape. We pay for the violence of our ancestors. From the collected sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
Jessica heard the disturbance in the great hall, turned on the light beside her bed. The clock there had not been properly adjusted to local time, and she had to subtract 21 minutes to determine that it was about 2 a.m. The disturbance was loud and incoherent. Is this the Harkonnen attack? She wondered. She slipped out of bed, checked the screen monitors to see where her family was. The screen showed Paul asleep in the deep cellar room they'd hastily converted to a bedroom for him. The noise obviously wasn't penetrating to his quarters. There was no one in the Duke's room. His bed was unrumpled. Was he still at the Field CP? There were no screens yet to the front of the house. Jessica stood in the middle of her room, listening. There was one shouting, incoherent voice. She heard someone call for Dr. Yueh. Jessica found a robe, pulled it over her shoulders, pushed her feet into slippers, strapped the crysknife to her leg. Again a voice called out for Yueh. Jessica belted the robe around her, stepped into the hallway. Then the thought struck her, what if Leto's hurt? The hall seemed to stretch out forever under her running feet. She turned through the arch at the end, dashed past the dining hall and down the passage to the great hall, finding the place brightly lighted, all the wall suspensors glowing at maximum. To her right, near the front entry, she saw 2 house guards holding Duncan Idaho between them. His head lolled forward, and there was an abrupt, panting silence to the scene. One of the house guards spoke accusingly to Idaho. "You see what you did? You woke the Lady Jessica." The great draperies billowed behind the men, showing that the front door remained open. There was no sign of the Duke or Yueh. Mapes stood to one side, staring coldly at Idaho. She wore a long brown robe with serpentine design at the hem. Her feet were pushed into unlaced desert boots.
"So I woke the Lady Jessica,"
Idaho muttered. He lifted his face toward the ceiling, bellowed,
"My sword was first blooded on Grumman."
"Great Mother, he's drunk," Jessica thought. Idaho's dark, round face was drawn into a frown. His hair, curling like the fur of a black goat, was plastered with dirt. A jagged rent in his tunic exposed an expanse of the dress shirt he had worn at the dinner party earlier. Jessica crossed to him. One of the guards nodded to her without releasing his hold on Idaho. "We didn't know what to do with him, my lady. He was creating a disturbance out front, refusing to come inside. We were afraid locals might come along and see him. That wouldn't do at all. Give us a bad name here." "Where has he been?" Jessica asked. "He escorted one of the young ladies home from the dinner, my lady. Howitt's orders." "Which young lady?" "One of the escort wenches. You understand, my lady?" He glanced at Mapes, lowered his voice. "They're always calling on Idaho for special surveillance of the ladies." And Jessica thought, so they are. But why is he drunk? She frowned, turned to Mapes. "Mapes, bring a stimulant. I'd suggest caffeine. Perhaps there's some of the spice coffee left." Mapes shrugged, headed for the kitchen. Her unlaced desert boots slap-slapped against the stone floor. Idaho swung his unsteady head around to peer at an angle toward Jessica.
"Killed more than 300 men for the Duke," he muttered. "What I want to know is why Mimir can't live under the ground here. Can't live on the ground here. What kind of place is this, huh?"
A sound from the side hall entry caught Jessica's attention. She turned, saw Yui crossing to them, his medical kit swinging in his left hand. He was fully dressed, looked pale, exhausted. The diamond tattoo stood out sharply on his forehead.
"The good doctor!"
Idaho shouted.
"What are you, Doc? Splint pill man?"
He turned blearily toward Jessica.
"Making a damn fool of myself, huh?"
Jessica frowned, remained silent, wondering, why would Idaho get drunk? Was he drugged?
"Too much spice beer,"
Idaho said, attempting to straighten. Mapes returned with a steaming cup in her hands, stopped uncertainly behind Yui. She looked at Jessica, who shook her head. Yui put his kit on the floor, nodded greeting to Jessica, said, "Spice beer, eh?"
"Best damn stuff ever tasted,"
Idaho said. He tried to pull himself to attention.
"My sword was first blooded on Grumman. Killed a Harkin. Killed him for the Duke."
Yui turned, looked at the cup in Mapes's hand. "What is that?" "Caffeine," Jessica said. Yui took the cup, held it toward Idaho. "Drink this, lad."
"Don't want any more to drink."
"Drink it, I say." Idaho's head wobbled toward Yui, and he stumbled one step ahead, dragging the guards with him.
"I'm almighty fed up with pleasing the Imperial Universe, Doc. Just once we're gonna do the thing my way."
"After you drink this," Yui said. "It's just caffeine."
"It's probably like all the rest of this place. Damn sun's too bright. Nothing has the right colour. Everything's wrong, or—"
"Well, it's night time now," Yui said. He spoke reasonably. "Drink this like a good lad. It'll make you feel better."
"Don't want to feel better."
"We can't argue with him all night," Jessica said, and she thought, this calls for shock treatment. "There's no reason for you to stay, my lady," Yui said. "I can take care of this." Jessica shook her head. She stepped forward, slapped Idaho sharply across the cheek. He stumbled back with his guards glaring at her. "This is no way to act in your Duke's home," she said. She snatched the cup from Yui's hands, spilling part of it, thrust the cup toward Idaho. "Now drink this. That's an order." Idaho jerked himself upright, scowling down at her. He spoke slowly, with careful and precise enunciation. "I do not take orders from a damn Harkonnen spy." Yui stiffened, whirled to face Jessica. Her face had gone pale, but she was nodding. It all became clear to her. The broken stems of meaning she had seen in words and actions around her these past few days could now be translated. She found herself in the grip of anger almost too great to contain. It took the most profound of her Bene Gesserit training to quiet her pulse and smooth her breathing. Even then she could feel the blaze flickering. They were always calling on Idaho for surveillance of the ladies. She shot a glance at Yui. The doctor lowered his eyes. "You knew this?" she demanded.
"I heard rumors, my lady, but I didn't want to add to your burdens."
"Hawat," she snapped. "I want Thufir Hawat brought to me immediately."
"But, my lady—"
"Immediately." It has to be Hawat, she thought. Suspicion such as this could come from no other source without being discarded immediately. Idaho shook his head, mumbled, "Chuck the whole damn thing." Jessica looked down at the cup in her hand, abruptly dashed its contents across Idaho's face.
"Lock him in one of the guest rooms of the East Wing," she ordered. "Let him sleep it off."
The two guards stared at her unhappily. One ventured, "Perhaps we should take him someplace else, milady. We could—"
"He's supposed to be here," Jessica snapped. "He has a job to do here." Her voice dripped bitterness. "He's so good at watching the ladies."
The guard swallowed.
"Do you know where the Duke is?" she demanded.
"He's at the command post, my lady."
"Is Hawat with him?"
"Hawat's in the city, my lady."
"You will bring Hawat to me at once," Jessica said. "I will be in my sitting room when he arrives."
"But, my lady—"
"If necessary, I will call the Duke," she said. "I hope it will not be necessary. I would not want to disturb him with this."
"Yes, my lady." Jessica thrust the empty cup into Mapes's hands, met the questioning stare of the blue within blue eyes.
"You may return to bed, Mapes." "You're sure you'll not need me?"
Jessica smiled grimly.
"I'm sure." "Perhaps this could wait until tomorrow," Yui said. "I could give you a sedative and—" "You will return to your quarters and leave me to handle this my way," she said. She patted his arm to take the sting out of her command. "This is the only way." Abruptly, head high, she turned and stalked off through the house to her rooms. Cold walls, passages, a familiar door. She jerked the door open, strode in, and slammed it behind her. Jessica stood there, glaring at the shield-blanked windows of her sitting room. Hawat! Could he be the one the Harkonnens bought? We shall see. Jessica crossed to the deep, old-fashioned armchair with an embroidered cover of schlag skin, moved the chair into position to command the door. She was suddenly very conscious of the crysknife in its sheath on her leg. She removed the sheath and strapped it to her arm, tested the drop of it. Once more she glanced around the room, placing everything precisely in her mind against any emergency. The chaise near the corner, the straight chairs along the wall, the two low tables, her stand-mounted zither beside the door to her bedroom. Pale rose light glowed from the suspenser lamps. She dimmed them, sat down in the armchair, patting the upholstery, appreciating the chair's regal heaviness for this occasion. "Now let him come," she thought. "We shall see what we shall see." And she prepared herself in the Bene Gesserit fashion for the wait, accumulating patience, saving her strength. Sooner than she had expected, a rap sounded at the door and Hawat entered at her command. She watched him without moving from the chair, seeing the crackling sense of drug-induced energy in his movements, seeing the fatigue beneath. Hawat's rheumy old eyes glittered. His leathery skin appeared faintly yellow in the room's light, and there was a wide, wet stain on the sleeve of his knife arm. She smelled blood there. Jessica gestured to one of the straight-backed chairs, said, "Bring that chair and sit facing me."
Howard bowed, obeyed. That drunken fool of an Idaho, he thought. He studied Jessica's face, wondering how he could save this situation.
"It's long past time to clear the air between us," Jessica said.
"What troubles, my lady?" He sat down, placed hands on knees.
"Don't play coy with me," she snapped. "If Hughie didn't tell you why I summoned you, then one of your spies in my household did. Shall we be at least that honest with each other?"
"As you wish, my lady."
"First, you will answer me one question," she said. "Are you now a Harkonnen agent?"
Howard surged half out of his chair, his face dark with fury, demanding, "You dare insult me so?"
"Sit down," she said. "You insulted me so."
Slowly he sank back into the chair, and Jessica, reading the signs of this face that she knew so well, allowed herself a deep breath. "It isn't Howard."
"Now I know you remain loyal to my Duke," she said. "I'm prepared, therefore, to forgive your affront to me."
"Is there something to forgive?"
Jessica scowled, wondering. Shall I play my trump? Shall I tell him of the Duke's daughter I've carried within me these few weeks? No. Leto himself doesn't know. This would only complicate his life, divert him in a time when he must concentrate on our survival. There is yet time to use this. "A truth-sayer would solve this," she said, "but we have no truth-sayer qualified by the High Board."
"As you say, we've no truth-sayer."
"Is there a traitor among us?" she asked. "I've studied our people with great care. Who could it be? Not Gurney. Certainly not Duncan. Their lieutenants are not strategically enough placed to consider. It's not you, Thufir. It cannot be Paul. I know it's not me. Dr. Huey, then? Shall I call him and put him to the test?"
"You know that's an empty gesture," Howard said. "He's conditioned by the High College. That I know for certain."
"Not to mention that his wife was a Bene Gesserit slain by the Harkonnens," Jessica said.
"So that's what happened to her," Howard said.
"Haven't you heard the hate in his voice when he speaks the Harkonnen name?"
"You know I don't have the ear," Howard said.
"What brought this base suspicion on me?" she asked.
Howard frowned.
"My lady puts her servant in an impossible position. My first loyalty is to the Duke." "I'm prepared to forgive much because of that loyalty," she said.
"And again I must ask, is there something to forgive?"
"Stalemate?" she asked.
He shrugged.
"Let us discuss something else for a minute, then," she said. "Duncan Idaho, the admirable fighting man whose abilities at guarding and surveillance are so esteemed. Tonight he overindulged in something called spice beer. I hear reports that others among our people have been stupefied by this concoction. Is that true?"
"You have your reports, my lady."
"So I do. Don't you see this drinking as a symptom, Thufir?"
"My lady speaks riddles."
"Apply your mentat abilities to it," she snapped. "What's the problem with Duncan and the others? I can tell you in 4 words. They have no home." He jabbed a finger at the floor.
"Arrakis? That's their home?"
"Arrakis is an unknown. Caladan was their home, but we've uprooted them. They have no home, and they fear the Duke's failing them."
He stiffened.
"Such talk from one of the men would be cause for—" "Oh, stop that, Thufir. Is it defeatist or treacherous for a doctor to diagnose a disease correctly? My only intention is to cure the disease."
"The Duke gives me charge over such matters."
"But you understand, I have a certain natural concern over the progress of this disease," she said. "And perhaps you'll grant I have certain abilities along these lines." Will I have to shock him severely? She wondered. He needs shaking up, something to break him from routine.
"There could be many interpretations for your concern," Howard said.
He shrugged. "Then you've already convicted me?"
"Of course not, my lady. but I cannot afford to take any chances, the situation being what it is."
"A threat to my son got past you, right here in this house," she said. "Who took that chance?" His face darkened.
"I offered my resignation to the Duke."
"Did you offer your resignation to me? Or to Paul?" Now he was openly angry, betraying it in quickness of breathing, in dilation of nostrils, a steady stare. She saw a pulse beating at his temple.
"I'm the Duke's man," he said, biting off the words.
"There is no traitor," she said. "The threat's something else. Perhaps it has to do with laser guns. Perhaps they'll risk secreting a few laser guns with timing mechanisms aimed at house shields. Perhaps they'll—"
"And who could tell after the blast if the explosion wasn't atomic?" he asked. "No, my lady, they'll not risk anything that illegal. Radiation lingers. The evidence is hard to erase. No, they'll observe most of the forms. It has to be a traitor."
"You're the Duke's man," she sneered. "Would you destroy him in the effort to save him?" He took a deep breath, then,
"If you're innocent, you'll have my most abject apologies."
"Look at you now, Thufir," she said. "Humans live best when each has his own place, when each knows where he belongs in the scheme of things. Destroy the place and destroy the person. You and I, Thufir, of all those who love the Duke, are most ideally situated to destroy the other's place. Could I not whisper suspicions about you into the Duke's ear at night? When would he be most susceptible to such whispering, Thufir? Must I draw it for you more clearly?"
"You threaten me?"
he growled. "Indeed not. I merely point out to you that someone is attacking us through the basic arrangement of our lives. It's clever, diabolical. I propose to negate this attack by so ordering our lives that there'll be no chinks for such barbs to enter."
"You accuse me of whispering baseless suspicions?"
"Baseless, yes."
"You'd meet this with your own whispers?"
"Your life is compounded of whispers, not mine, Thufir."
"Then you question my abilities."
She sighed. "Thufir, I want you to examine your own emotional involvement in this. The natural human's an animal without logic. Your projections of logic onto all affairs is unnatural, but suffered to continue for its usefulness. You're the embodiment of logic, a mentat. Yet your problem solutions are concepts that, in a very real sense, are projected outside yourself, there to be studied and rolled around, examined from all sides."
"You think now to teach me my trade?"
he asked, and he did not try to hide the disdain in his voice. "Anything outside yourself, this you can see and apply your logic to it," she said. "But it's a human trait that when we encounter personal problems, those things most deeply personal are the most difficult to bring out for our logic to scan. We tend to flounder around, blaming everything but the actual deep-seated thing that's really chewing on us."
"You're deliberately attempting to undermine my faith in my abilities as a mentat," he rasped. "Were I to find one of our people attempting thus to sabotage any other weapon in our arsenal, I should not hesitate to denounce and destroy him."
"The finest mentats have a healthy respect for the error factor in their computations," she said.
"I've never said otherwise."
"Then apply yourself to these symptoms we've both seen. Drunkenness among the men, quarrels. They gossip and exchange wild rumours about Arrakis. They ignore the most simple—"
"Idleness no more," he said. "Don't try to divert my attention by trying to make a simple matter appear mysterious."
She stared at him, thinking of the Duke's men rubbing their woes together in the barracks until you could almost smell the charge there, like burnt insulation. "They're becoming like the men of the pre-Guild legend," she thought. "Like the men of the lost star-searcher, Ampoliros, sick at their guns, forever seeking, forever prepared, and forever unready." "Why have you never made full use of my abilities in your service to the Duke?" she asked. "Do you fear a rival for your position?" He glared at her, the old eyes blazing.
"I know something of the training they give you, Bene Gesserit." He broke off, scowling. "Go ahead, say it," she said. "Bene Gesserit witches."
"I know something of the real training they give you," he said. "I've seen it come out in Paul. I'm not fooled by what your schools tell the public. You exist only to serve."
The shock must be severe. And he's almost ready for it, she thought. "You listen respectfully to me in counsel," she said, "yet you seldom heed my advice. Why?"
"I don't trust your Bene Gesserit motives," he said. "You may think you can look through a man. You may think you can make a man do exactly what you—"
"You poor fool, Thufir!" she raged. He scowled, pushing himself back in the chair. "Whatever rumours you've heard about our schools," she said, "the truth is far greater. If I wished to destroy the Duke, or you, or any other person within my reach, you could not stop me." And she thought, why do I let pride drive such words out of me? This is not the way I was trained. This is not how I must shock him. Howard slipped a hand beneath his tunic, where he kept a tiny projector of poison darts. She wears no shield, he thought. Is this just a brag she makes? I could slay her now, but... the consequences, if I'm wrong. Jessica saw the gesture toward his pocket, said, "Let us pray violence shall never be necessary between us."
"A worthy prayer," he agreed.
"Meanwhile, the sickness spreads among us," she said. "I must ask you again, isn't it more reasonable to suppose the Harkonnens have planted this suspicion to pit the two of us against each other?"
"We appear to have returned to stalemate," he said.
She sighed, thinking, he's almost ready for it. "The Duke and I are father and mother surrogates to our people," she said. "The position—"
"He hasn't married you?"
Howard said. She forced herself to calmness, thinking, a good riposte, that. "But he'll not marry anyone else," she said. "Not as long as I live. And we are surrogates, as I've said. To break up this natural order in our affairs, to disturb, disrupt, and confuse us, which target offers itself most enticingly to the Harkonnens?" He sensed the direction she was taking, and his brows drew down in a lowering scowl. "The Duke?" she asked. "Attractive target, yes. But no one, with the possible exception of Paul, is better guarded. Me? I tempt them, surely. But they must know the Bene Gesserit make difficult targets. And there's a better target, one whose duties create, necessarily, a monstrous blind spot, one to whom suspicion is as natural as breathing, one who builds his entire life on innuendo and mystery." She darted her right hand toward him. "You!" Howard started to leap from his chair. "I have not dismissed you, Thufir," she flared. The old mentat almost fell back into the chair, so quickly did his muscles betray him. She smiled without mirth. "Now you know something of the real training they give us," she said. Howard tried to swallow in a dry throat. Her command had been regal, peremptory, uttered in a tone and manner he had found completely irresistible. His body had obeyed her before he could think about it. Nothing could have prevented his response, not logic, not passionate anger, nothing. To do what she had done spoke of a sensitive, intimate knowledge of the person thus commanded, a depth of control he had not dreamed possible. "I have said to you before that we should understand each other," she said. "I meant you should understand me. I already understand you. And I tell you now that your loyalty to the Duke is all that guarantees your safety with me." He stared at her, wet his lips with his tongue. "If I desired a puppet, the Duke would marry me," she said. "He might even think he did it of his own free will." Howard lowered his head, looked upward through his sparse lashes. Only the most rigid control kept him from calling the guard. Control. And the suspicion now that woman might not permit it. His skin crawled with the memory of how she had controlled him. In the moment of hesitation she could have drawn a weapon and killed him. Does every human have this blind spot? He wondered. Can any of us be ordered into action before he can resist? The idea staggered him. Who could stop a person with such power? "You've glimpsed the fist within the Bene Gesserit glove," she said. "Few glimpse it and live. And what I did was a relatively simple thing for us. You've not seen my entire arsenal. Think on that."
"Why aren't you out destroying the Duke's enemies?"
he asked. "What would you have me destroy?" she asked. "Would you have me make a weakling of our Duke? Have him forever leaning on me?"
"But with such power—"
"Power's a two-edged sword, Thufir," she said. "You think, how easy for her to shape a human tool to thrust into an enemy's vitals. True, Thufir, even into your vitals. Yet what would I accomplish? If enough of us, Bene Gesserit, did this, wouldn't it make all Bene Gesserit suspect? We don't want that, Thufir. We do not wish to destroy ourselves." She nodded. "We truly exist only to serve."
"I cannot answer you," he said. "You know I cannot answer."
"You'll say nothing about what has happened here to anyone," she said. "I know you, Thufir."
"My lady."
Again the old man tried to swallow in a dry throat. And he thought, she has great powers, yes, but would these not make her an even more formidable tool for the Harkonnens? "The Duke could be destroyed as quickly by his friends as by his enemies," she said. "I trust now you'll get to the bottom of this suspicion and remove it."
"If it proves baseless," he said.
"If," she sneered.
"If,"
he said. "You are tenacious," she said.
"Cautious," he said, "and aware of the error factor."
"Then I'll pose another question for you. What does it mean to you that you stand before another human, that you are bound and helpless, and the other human holds a knife at your throat, yet this other human refrains from killing you, frees you from your bonds, and gives you the knife to use as you will?" She lifted herself out of the chair, turned her back on him. "You may go now, Thufir." The old Mentat arose, hesitated, hand creeping toward the deadly weapon beneath his tunic. He was reminded of the bull ring, and of the Duke's father, who'd been brave no matter what his other failings, and one day of the corrida long ago. The fierce black beast had stood there, head bowed, immobilized and confused. The old Duke had turned his back on the horns, cape thrown flamboyantly over one arm, while cheers rained down from the stands. "I am the bull, and she the matador," Hawat thought. He withdrew his hand from the weapon, glanced at the sweat glistening in his empty palm, and he knew that whatever the facts proved to be in the end, he would never forget this moment, nor lose this sense of supreme admiration for the Lady Jessica. Quietly, he turned and left the room. Jessica lowered her gaze from the reflection in the windows, turned, and stared at the closed door. "Now we'll see some proper action," she whispered.
Do you wrestle with dreams? Do you contend with shadows? Do you move in a kind of sleep? Time has slipped away. Your life is stolen. You tarried with trifles, victim of your folly. Dirge for Jameis on the funeral plain. From Songs of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
Leto stood in the foyer of his house, studying a note by the light of a single suspenser lamp. Dawn was yet a few hours away, and he felt his tiredness. A Fremen messenger had brought the note to the outer guard just now as the Duke arrived from his command post. The note read, "A column of smoke by day, a pillar of fire by night." And there was no signature. What does it mean? He wondered. The messenger had gone without waiting for an answer, and before he could be questioned. He had slipped into the night like some smoky shadow. Leto pushed the paper into a tunic pocket, thinking to show it to Hawat later. He brushed a lock of hair from his forehead, took a sighing breath. The anti-fatigue pills were beginning to wear thin. It had been a long 2 days since the dinner party, and longer than that since he had slept. On top of all the military problems, there'd been the disquieting session with Howard, the report on his meeting with Jessica. Should I waken Jessica? He wondered. There's no reason to play the secrecy game with her any longer. Or is there? Blast and damn that Duncan, Idaho. He shook his head. No, not Duncan. I was wrong not to take Jessica into my confidence from the first. I must do it now, before more damage is done. The decision made him feel better, and he hurried from the foyer through the great hall and down the passages toward the family wing. At the turn where the passages split to the service area, he paused. A strange mewling came from somewhere down the service passage. Leto put his left hand to the switch on his shield belt, slipped his kinjal into his right hand. The knife conveyed a sense of reassurance. That strange sound had sent a chill through him. Softly, the Duke moved down the service passage, cursing the inadequate illumination. The smallest of suspensors had been spaced about 8 meters apart along here, and tuned to their dimmest level. The dark stone walls swallowed the light. A dull blob stretching across the floor appeared out of the gloom ahead. Leto hesitated, almost activated his shield, but refrained because that would limit his movements, his hearing, and because the captured shipment of lasguns had left him filled with doubts. Silently he moved toward the grey blob, saw that it was a human figure, a man face down on the stone. Leto turned him over with a foot. Knife poised, bent close in the dim light to see the face. It was the smuggler, Tuek, a wet stain down his chest. The dead eyes stared with empty darkness. Leto touched the stain. Warm. How could this man be dead here? Leto asked himself. Who killed him? The mewling sound was louder here. It came from ahead and down the side passage to the central room where they had installed the main shield generator for the house. Hand on belt switch, kinjal poised, the Duke skirted the body, slipped down the passage and peered around the corner toward the shield generator room. Another grey blob lay stretched on the floor a few paces away, and he saw at once that this was the source of the noise. The shape crawled toward him with painful slowness, gasping, mumbling. Leto stilled his sudden constriction of fear, darted down the passage, crouched beside the crawling figure. It was Mapes, the Fremen housekeeper, her hair tumbled around her face, clothing disarrayed. A dull shininess of dark stain spread from her back along her side. He touched her shoulder, and she lifted herself on her elbows, head tipped up to peer at him, the eyes black-shadowed emptiness.
"It's you! Killed God. Sent get Tuek. Escape. Milady. You here. No.
She flopped forward, her head thumping against the stone. Leto felt for pulse at the temples. There was none. He looked at the stain. She'd been stabbed in the back. Who? His mind raced. Did she mean someone had killed a guard? And Tuek? Had Jessica sent for him? Why? He started to stand up. A sixth sense warned him. He flashed a hand toward the shield switch. Too late. A numbing shock slammed his arm aside. He felt pain there, saw a dart protruding from the sleeve, sensed paralysis spreading from it up his arm. It took an agonizing effort to lift his head and look down the passage. Yui stood in the open door of the generator room. His face reflected yellow from the light of a single, brighter suspensor above the door. There was stillness from the room behind him, no sound of generators. Yui, Leto thought. He's sabotaged the house generators. We're wide open. Yui began walking toward him, pocketing a dart gun.
Yui! How?
The paralysis reached his legs and he slid to the floor with his back, propped against the stone wall. Yue's face carried a look of sadness as he bent over, touched Leto's forehead. The Duke found he could feel the touch, but it was remote, dull.
The drug on the dart is selective. You can speak, but I'd advise against it.
He glanced down the hall and again bent over Leto, pulled out the dart, tossed it aside. The sound of the dart clattering on the stones was faint and distant to the Duke's ears. It can't be Yue, Leto thought. He's conditioned.
How? I'm sorry, my dear Duke, but there are things which will make greater demands than this.
Yue touched the diamond tattoo on his forehead.
I find it very strange myself. An override on my pyretic conscience. But I wish to kill a man. Yes, I actually wish it. I will stop at nothing to do it.
He looked down at the Duke.
Oh, not you, my dear Duke. The Baron Harkonnen. I wish to kill the Baron. Be quiet, please, my dear Duke. You haven't much time. That peg tooth I put in your mouth after the tumble at Narkal. That tooth must be replaced. In a moment I'll render you unconscious and replace that tooth.
He opened his hand, stared at something in it.
An exact duplicate, its core shaped most exquisitely like a nerve. It'll escape the usual detectors, even a fast scanning, but if you bite down hard on it, the cover crushes. Then when you expel your breath sharply, you fill the air around you with a poison gas. Most deadly.
Leto stared up at Yue, seeing madness in the man's eyes, the perspiration along brow and chin.
You were dead anyway, my poor Duke. But you will get close to the Baron before you die. He'll believe you're stupefied by drugs beyond any dying effort to attack him. And you will be drugged and tied, but attack can take strange forms. And you will remember the tooth. The tooth, Duke Leto Atreides. You will remember the tooth.
The old doctor leaned closer and closer until his face and drooping mustache dominated Leto's narrowing vision.
The tooth. Why?
Yue lowered himself to one knee beside the Duke.
I made a shaitan's bargain with the Baron, and I must be certain he has fulfilled his half of it. When I see him, I'll know. When I look at the Baron, then I will know. But I'll never enter his presence without the price. You're the price, my poor Duke. And I'll know when I see him. My poor Warner taught me many things, and one is to see certainty of truth when the stress is great. I cannot do it always, but when I see the Baron, then I will know.
Leto tried to look down at the tooth in Yue's hand. He felt this was happening in a nightmare. It could not be. Yue's purple lips turned up in a grimace.
I'll not get close enough to the Baron, or I'd do this myself. No, I'll be detained at a safe distance. But you, now, you, my lovely weapon. He'll want you close to him to gloat over you, to boast a little.
Leto found himself almost hypnotized by a muscle on the left side of Yue's jaw. The muscle twisted when the man spoke. Yue leaned closer.
And you, my good Duke, my precious Duke, you must remember this tooth.
He held it up between thumb and forefinger.
It will be all that remains to you.
Leto's mouth moved without sound. Then...
Refuse. Ah, no. You mustn't refuse, because in return For this small service, I'm doing a thing for you. I will save your son and your woman. No other can do it. They can be removed to a place where no Harkonnen can reach them.
How? Save them?
By making it appear they're dead. By secreting them among people who draw knife at hearing the Harkonnen name, who hate the Harkonnens so much they'll burn a chair in which a Harkonnen has sat, salt the ground over which a Harkonnen has walked. Can you feel anything in your jaw?
He touched Leto's jaw. The Duke found that he could not answer. He sensed distant tugging, saw Yui's hand come up with a ducal signet ring.
For Paul, you'll be unconscious presently. Goodbye, my poor Duke. When next we meet, we'll have no time for conversation.
Cool remoteness spread upward from Leto's jaw, across his cheeks. The shadowy hall narrowed to a pinpoint, with Yui's purple lips centered in it.
Remember the tooth. The tooth.
There should be a science of discontent. People need hard times and oppression to develop psychic muscles. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
Jessica awoke in the dark, feeling premonition in the stillness around her. She could not understand why her mind and body felt so sluggish. Skin raspings of fear ran along her nerves. She thought of sitting up and turning on a light, but something stayed the decision. Her mouth felt strange. Lump, 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 lump. It was a dull sound, directionless in the dark. Somewhere, the waiting moment was packed with time, with rustling needle-stick movements. She began to feel her body, grew aware of bindings on wrists and ankles, a gag in her mouth. She was on her side, hands tied behind her. She tested the bindings, realized they were crimskull fiber, would only claw tighter as she pulled. And now she remembered. There had been movement in the darkness of her bedroom. Something wet and pungent slapped against her face, filling her mouth, hands grasping for her. She had gasped, one indrawn breath, sensing the narcotic in the wetness. Consciousness had receded, sinking her into a black bin of terror. It has come, she thought. How simple it was to subdue the Bene Gesserit. All it took was treachery. Hawat was right. She forced herself not to pull on her bindings. This is not my bedroom, she thought. They've taken me someplace else. Slowly she marshaled the inner calmness. She grew aware of the smell of her own stale sweat with its chemical infusion of fear. Where is Paul? She asked herself. My son, what have they done to him? Calmness. She forced herself to it, using the ancient routines, but terror remained so near. Leto. Where are you, Leto? She sensed a diminishing in the dark. It began with shadows. Dimensions separated, became new thorns of awareness. White. A line under a door. I'm on the floor. People walking. She sensed it through the floor. Jessica squeezed back the memory of terror. I must remain calm, alert, and prepared. I may get only one chance. Again she forced the inner calmness. The ungainly thumping of her heartbeats evened, shaping out time. She counted back. I was unconscious about an hour. She closed her eyes, focused her awareness onto the approaching footsteps. 4 people. She counted the differences in their steps. I must pretend I'm still unconscious. She relaxed against the cold floor, testing her body's readiness, heard a door open, sensed increased light through her eyelids. Feet approached. Someone standing over her.
You are awake. Do not pretend.
She opened her eyes. The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen stood over her. Around them she recognized the cellar room where Paul had slept, saw his cot at one side, empty. Suspensor lamps were brought in by guards, distributed near the open door. There was a glare of light in the hallway beyond that hurt her eyes. She looked up at the Baron. He wore a yellow cape that bulged over his portable suspensors. The fat cheeks were two cherubic mounds beneath spider-black eyes.
The drug was timed. We knew to the minute when you'd be coming out of it.
How could that be? She wondered. They'd have to know my exact weight, my metabolism, my... Yui.
Such a pity you must remain gagged. We could have such an interesting conversation.
Yui's the only one it could be, she thought. How? The Baron glanced behind him at the door.
Come in, Piter.
She had never before seen the man who entered to stand beside the Baron, but the face was known. And the man, Piter de Vries, the Mentat assassin. She studied him. Hawk features, blue-ink eyes that suggested he was a native of Arrakis, but subtleties of movement and stance that told her he was not. And his flesh was too well firmed with water. He was tall, though slender, and something about him suggested effeminacy.
Such a pity we cannot have our conversation, my dear Lady Jessica. However, I am aware of your abilities.
He glanced at the Mentat.
Isn't that true, Piter?
As you say, Baron.
The voice touched her spine with a wash of coldness. She had never heard such a chill voice. To one with a Bene Gesserit training, the voice screamed, killer.
I have a surprise for Piter. He thinks he has come here to collect his reward. You, Lady Jessica. But I wish to demonstrate a thing, that he does not really want you.
You'll play with me, Baron?
Piter smiled. Seeing that smile, Jessica wondered that the Baron did not leap to defend himself from this Piter. Then she corrected herself. The Baron could not read that smile. He did not have the training.
In many ways, Piter is quite naive. He doesn't admit to himself what a deadly creature you are, Lady Jessica. I'd show him, but it'd be a foolish risk.
The Baron smiled at Piter, whose face had become a waiting mask.
I know what Piter really wants. Piter wants power.
You promised I could have her.
The tenor voice had lost some of its cold reserve. Jessica heard the clue tones in the man's voice, allowing herself an inward shudder. How could the Baron have made such an animal out of a Mentat?
I give you a choice, Piter.
What choice?
The Baron snapped fat fingers.
This woman, and exile from the Imperium, or the Duchy of Atreides on Arrakis to rule as you see fit in my name.
Jessica watched the Baron's spider eyes study Piter.
You could be Duke here in all but name.
Is my Leto dead, then? Jessica asked herself. She felt a silent wail begin somewhere in her mind. The Baron kept his attention on the Mentat.
Understand yourself, Piter. You want her because she was a duke's woman, a symbol of his power, beautiful, useful, exquisitely trained for her role. But an entire duchy, Piter. That's more than a symbol. That's the reality. With it, you could have many women, and more.
You do not joke with Piter?
The Baron turned with that dancing lightness the suspensors gave him.
Joke, I? Remember, I am giving up the boy. You heard what the traitor said about the lad's training. They are alike, this mother and son. Deadly. I must go now. I will send in the guard I've reserved for this moment. He's stone deaf. His orders will be to convey you on the first leg of your journey into exile. He will subdue this woman if he sees her gain control of you. He'll not permit you to untie her gag until you're off Arrakis. If you choose not to leave, he has other orders.
You don't have to leave. I've chosen.
Such quick decision can mean only one thing.
I will take the duchy.
And Jessica thought, doesn't Peiter know the Baron's lying to him? But how could he know? He's a twisted mentat. The Baron glanced down at Jessica.
Is it not wonderful that I know Peiter so well? I wagered with my master-at-arms that this would be Peiter's choice. Well, I leave now. Oh, this is much better. Much better. You understand, Lady Jessica? I had no rancor toward you. It's a necessity. Much better this way. Yes. And I've not actually ordered you destroyed. When it's asked of me what happened to you, I can shrug it off in all truth.
You leave it to me, then?
The guard I send you will take your orders. Whatever's done, I leave to you. Yes, there will be no blood on my hands here. It's your decision. Yes, I know nothing of it. You will wait until I've gone before doing whatever you must do. Yes, well. Yes. Yes. Good.
He fears the questioning of a truth-sayer, Jessica thought. Who? The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen, of course. If he knows he must face her questions, then the Emperor is in on this for sure. My poor Leto. With one last glance at Jessica, the Baron turned, went out the door. She followed him with her eyes, thinking, it's as the Reverend Mother warned, too potent an adversary. 2 Harkonnen troopers entered. Another, his face a scarred mask, followed, and stood in the doorway with drawn laser-gun. The deaf one, Jessica thought, studying the scarred face. The Baron knows I could use the voice on any other man. Scarface looked at Peiter.
Leave the boy on a litter outside. What are your orders?
Peiter spoke to Jessica.
I'd thought of binding you by a threat held over your son, but I begin to see that would not have worked. I let emotion cloud reason. Bad policy for a mentat.
He looked at the first pair of troopers, turning so the deaf one could read his lips.
Take them into the desert, as the traitor suggested for the boy. His plan is a good one. The worms will destroy all evidence. Their bodies must never be found.
You don't wish to dispatch them yourself?
He reads lips, Jessica thought.
I follow my Baron's example. Take them where the traitor said.
Jessica heard the harsh mentat control in Peiter's voice, thought, he too fears the truth-sayer. Peiter shrugged, turned and went through the doorway. He hesitated there, and Jessica thought he might turn back for a last look at her, but he went out without turning.
Me, I wouldn't like the thought of facing that truth-sayer after this night's work.
You ain't likely ever to run into that old witch.
One of the other troopers went around to Jessica's head, bent over her.
It ain't getting our work done standing around here chattering. Take her feet.
Why don't we kill him here?
Too messy. Unless you wants to strangle him. Me? I likes a nice straightforward job. Drop him on the desert like that traitor said, cut him once or twice, leave the evidence for the worms. Nothing to clean up afterwards.
Yeah, well, I guess you're right.
Jessica listened to them, watching, registering. But the gag blocked her voice, and there was the deaf one to consider. Scarface holstered his laser-gun, took her feet. They lifted her like a sack of grain, manoeuvred her through the door, and dumped her onto a suspensor-buoyed litter with another bound figure. As they turned her, fitting her to the litter, she saw her companion's face. Paul. He was bound, but not gagged. His face was no more than 10 centimeters from hers, eyes closed, his breathing even. Is he drugged? She wondered. The troops lifted the litter, and Paul's eyes opened the smallest fraction, dark slits staring at her. He mustn't try the voice, she prayed. The deaf guard. Paul's eyes closed. He had been practicing the awareness breathing, calming his mind, listening to their captors. The deaf one posed a problem, but Paul contained his despair. The mind-calming Bene Gesserit regimen his mother had taught him kept him poised, ready to expand any opportunity. Paul allowed himself another slit-eyed inspection of his mother's face. She appeared unharmed, gagged, though. He wondered who could have captured her. His own captivity was plain enough, to bed with a capsule prescribed by Yui, awaking to find himself bound to this litter. Perhaps a similar thing had befallen her. Logic said the traitor was Yui, but he held final decision in abeyance. There was no understanding it. A Sook doctor, a traitor. The litter tipped slightly as the Harkonnen troopers maneuvered it through a doorway into starlit night. A suspensor boy rasped against the doorway. Then they were on sand, feet grating in it. A thopter wing loomed overhead, blotting the stars. The litter settled to the ground. Paul's eyes adjusted to the faint light. He recognized the deaf trooper as the man who opened the thopter door, peered inside at the green gloom illuminated by the instrument panel.
This the thopter we're supposed to use?
He turned to watch his companion's lips.
It's the one the trader said was fixed for desert work.
But it's one of them little liaison jobs. Ain't room in there for more than them and two of us.
Two's enough. We can take care of it from here on, Kinnett.
The Baron, he told me to make sure what happened to them two.
What you so worried about?
She's a Bene Gesserit witch. They have powers.
Ah.
The litter-bearer made the sign of the fist at his ear.
One of them, eh? Know what you mean.
She'll be worm meat soon enough. Don't suppose even a Bene Gesserit witch has powers over one of them big worms, eh, Zygo?
He nudged the litter-bearer.
Yep.
The litter-bearer returned to the litter, took Jessica's shoulders.
Come on, Kinnett. You can go along if you wants to make sure what happens.
It's nice of you to invite me, Zygo.
Jessica felt herself lifted, the wing shadows spinning stars. She was pushed into the rear of the thopter, her crimscale fibre bindings examined, and she was strapped down. Paul was jammed in beside her, strapped securely, and she noted his bonds were simple rope. Scarface, the deaf one they called Kinnett, took his place in front. The litter-bearer, the one they called Zygo, came around and took the other front seat. Kinnett closed his door, bent to the controls. The thopter took off in a wing-tucked surge, headed south over the shield wall. Zygo tapped his companion's shoulder.
Why don't you turn around and keep an eye on them two?
Sure you know the way to go?
Kinnett watched Zygo's lips.
I listened to the trader same's you.
Kinnett swiveled his seat. Jessica saw the glint of starlight on a laser gun in his hand. The thopter's light-walled interior seemed to collect illumination as her eyes adjusted, but the guard's scarred face remained dim. Jessica tested her seatbelt, found it loose. She felt roughness in the strap against her left arm, realized the strap had been almost severed, would snap at a sudden jerk. Has someone been at this thopter, preparing it for us? She wondered. Who? Slowly she twisted her bound feet clear of Paul's.
Sure do seem a shame to waste a good-looking woman like this. You ever have any high-born types?
He turned to look at the pilot.
Bene Gesserit ain't all highborn.
But they all looks Heidi.
He can see me plain enough, Jessica thought. She brought her bound legs up onto the seat, curled into a sinuous ball, staring at Scarface.
Real pretty she is. Sure do seem a shame.
Kinnett wet his lips with his tongue. He looked at Zygo.
You thinking what I think you're thinking?
Who'd be to know? Afterwards, just never had me no highborns. Might never get a chance like this one again.
You lay a hand on my mother.
Paul glared at Scarface.
Hey, Cub's gotta bark. Ain't got no bite, though.
And Jessica thought, Paul's pitching his voice too high. It may work, though. They flew on in silence. These poor fools, Jessica thought, studying her guards and reviewing the Baron's words. They'll be killed as soon as they report success on their mission. The Baron wants no witnesses. The Thopter banked over the southern rim of the shield wall, and Jessica saw a moon-shadowed expanse of sand beneath them.
This ought to be far enough. The trader said to put him on the sand anywhere near the shield wall.
He dipped the craft toward the dunes in a long, falling stoop, brought it up stiffly over the desert surface. Jessica saw Paul begin taking the rhythmic breaths of the calming exercise. He closed his eyes, opened them. Jessica stared, helpless to aid him. He hasn't mastered the voice yet, she thought. If he fails... The Thopter touched sand with a soft lurch, and Jessica, looking north back across the shield wall, saw a shadow of wings settle out of sight up there. Someone's following us, she thought. Who? Then, the ones the Baron set to watch this pair. And there'll be watchers for the watchers, too. Zygo shut off his wing rotors. Silence flooded in upon them. Jessica turned her head. She could see out the window beyond Scarface a dim glow of light from a rising moon, a frosted rim of rock rising from the desert. Sandblast ridges streaked its sides. Paul cleared his throat.
Now, Kinnett?
I don't know, Zygo.
Zygo turned.
Ah, look.
He reached out for Jessica's skirt.
Remove her gag.
Jessica felt the words rolling in the air. The tone, the timbre excellent, imperative, very sharp. A slightly lower pitch would have been better, but it could still fall within this man's spectrum. Zygo shifted his hand up to the band around Jessica's mouth, slipped the knot on the gag.
Stop that.
Shut your trap. Her hands are tied.
He freed the knot, and the binding dropped. His eyes glittered as he studied Jessica. Kinnett put a hand on the pilot's arm.
Look, Zygo, no need to...
Jessica twisted her neck, spat out the gag. She pitched her voice in low, intimate tones.
Gentlemen, no need to fight over me.
At the same time, she writhed sinuously for Kinnett's benefit. She saw them grow tense, knowing that in this instant they were convinced of the need to fight over her. Their disagreement required no other reason. In their minds they were fighting over her. She held her face high in the instrument glow to be sure Kinnett would read her lips.
You mustn't disagree.
They drew farther apart, glanced warily at each other.
Is any woman worth fighting over?
By uttering the words, by being there, she made herself infinitely worth their fighting. Paul clamped his lips tightly closed, forced himself to be silent. There had been the one chance for him to succeed with the voice. Now everything depended on his mother, whose experience went so far beyond his own.
Yeah, no need to...
His hand flashed toward the pilot's neck. The blow was met by a splash of metal that caught the arm and in the same motion slammed into Kinnett's chest. Scarface groaned, sagged backward against his door.
Thought I was some dummy didn't know that trick.
He brought back his hand, revealing the knife. It glittered in reflected moonlight.
Now for the cub.
He leaned toward Paul.
No need for that.
Zygo hesitated.
Wouldn't you rather have me cooperative? Give the boy a chance. Little enough chance he'd have out there in that sand. Give him that, and you could find yourself well rewarded.
Zygo glanced left, right, returned his attention to Jessica.
I've heard what can happen to a man in this desert. Boy might find the knife a kindness.
Is it so much I ask?
You're trying to trick me.
I don't want to see my son die. Is that a trick?
Zygo moved back, elbowed the door latch. He grabbed Paul, dragged him across the seat, pushed him half out the door, and held the knife poised.
What'll you do, cub, if I cut your bonds?
He'll leave here immediately and head for those rocks.
Is that what you'll do, cub?
Yes.
Paul's voice was properly surly. The knife moved down, slashed the bindings of his legs. Paul felt the hand on his back to hurl him down onto the sand, feigned a lurch against the door frame for purchase, turned as though to catch himself, lashed out with his right foot. The toe was aimed with a precision that did credit to his long years of training, as though all of that training focused on this instant. Almost every muscle of his body cooperated in the placement of it. The tip struck the soft part of Zygo's abdomen just below the sternum, slammed upward with terrible force over the liver and through the diaphragm to crush the right ventricle of the man's heart. With one gurgling scream, the guard jerked backward across the seats. Paul, unable to use his hands, continued his tumble onto the sand, landing with a roll that took up the force and brought him back to his feet in one motion. He dove back into the cabin, found the knife and held it in his teeth while his mother sawed her bonds. She took the blade and freed his hands.
I could have handled him. He'd have had to cut my bindings. That was a foolish risk.
I saw the opening and used it.
She heard the harsh control in his voice.
Yui's house sign is scrawled on the ceiling of this cabin.
He looked up, saw the curling symbol.
Get out and let us study this craft. There's a bundle under the pilot's seat. I felt it when we got in.
Bomb?
Doubt it. There's something peculiar here.
Paul leaped out to the sand and Jessica followed. She turned, reached under the seat for the strange bundle, seeing Zygo's feet close to her face, feeling dampness on the bundle as she removed it, realizing the dampness was the pilot's blood. Waste of moisture, she thought, knowing that this was Arakeen thinking. Paul stared around them, saw the rock scarp lifting out of the desert like a beach rising from the sea, wind-carved palisades beyond. He turned back as his mother lifted the bundle from the thopter, saw her stare across the dunes toward the shield wall. He looked to see what drew her attention, saw another thopter swooping toward them, realized they'd not have time to clear the bodies out of this thopter and escape.
Run, Paul, it's Harkonnens! Arrakis teaches the attitude of the knife, chopping off what's incomplete and saying now it's complete because it's ended here. From Collected Sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
A man in Harkonnen uniform skidded to a stop at the end of the hall, stared in at Yui, taking in at a single glance Mapes's body, the sprawled form of the Duke, Yui standing there. The man held a lasgun in his right hand. There was a casual air of brutality about him, a sense of toughness and poise that sent a shiver through Yui. Sardaukar, Yui thought. A Bashar, by the look of him. Probably one of the Emperor's own sent here to keep an eye on things. No matter what the uniform, there's no disguising them. "You're Yui," the man said. He looked speculatively at the Sook school ring on the doctor's hair, stared once at the diamond tattoo, and then met Yui's eyes. "I am Yui," the doctor said. "You can relax, Yui," the man said. "When you dropped the house shields, we came right in. Everything's under control here. Is this the Duke?" "This is the Duke." "Dead?" "Merely unconscious. I suggest you tie him." "Did you do for these others?" He glanced back down the hall where Mapes's body lay. "More's the pity," Yui muttered. "Pity," the Sardaukar sneered. He advanced, looked down at Leto. "So that's the great Red Duke." If I had any doubts about what this man is, that would end them, Yui thought. Only the Emperor calls the Atreides the Red Dukes. The Sardaukar reached down, cut the red hawk insignia from Leto's uniform. "Little souvenir," he said. "Where's the ducal signet ring?" "He doesn't have it on him," Yui said. "I can see that," the Sardaukar snapped. Yui stiffened, swallowed. "If they press me, bring in a truthsayer. They'll find out about the ring, about the thopter I prepared. All will fail. Sometimes the Duke sent the ring with a messenger as surety that an order came directly from him," Yui said. "Must be damned trusted messengers," the Sardaukar muttered. "Aren't you going to tie him?" Yui ventured. How long will he be unconscious?
2 hours or so. I wasn't as precise with his dosage as I was for the woman and boy."
The Sardaukar spurned the Duke with his toe. "This was nothing to fear even when awake. When will the woman and boy awaken?"
"About 10 minutes.
So soon?
I was told the Baron would arrive immediately behind his men."
"So he will. You'll wait outside, Yui."
He shot a hard glance at Yui.
"Now."
Yui glanced at Leto. "What about—"
"He'll be delivered to the Baron all properly trussed, like a roast for the oven." Again the Sardaukar looked at the diamond tattoo on Yui's forehead. "You're known. You'll be safe enough in the halls. We've no more time for chit-chat, traitor. I hear the others coming."
Traitor, Yui thought. He lowered his gaze, pressed past the Sardaukar, knowing this as a foretaste of how history would remember him. Yui, the traitor. He passed more bodies on his way to the front entrance and glanced at them, fearful that one might be Paul or Jessica. All were house troopers, or wore Harkonnen uniform. Harkonnen guards came alert, staring at him as he emerged from the front entrance into flame-lighted night. The palms along the road had been fired to illuminate the house. Black smoke from the flammables used to ignite the trees poured upward through orange flames.
"It's the traitor," someone said. "The Baron will want to see you soon," another said.
"I must get to the Thopter," Yui thought. "I must put the ducal signet where Paul will find it." And fear struck him. If Idaho suspects me, or grows impatient, if he doesn't wait and go exactly where I told him, Jessica and Paul will not be saved from the carnage. I'll be denied even the smallest relief from my act. The Harkonnen guard released his arm, said,
"Wait over there, out of the way."
Abruptly, Yui saw himself as cast away in this place of destruction. Spared nothing, given not the smallest pity. Idaho must not fail.
Another guard bumped into him, barked, "Stay out of the way, you!"
Even when they've profited by me, they despise me, Yui thought. He straightened himself as he was pushed aside, regained some of his dignity.
"Wait for the Baron," a guard officer snarled.
Yui nodded, walked with controlled casualness along the front of the house, turned the corner into shadows out of sight of the burning palms. Quickly, every step betraying his anxiety, Yui made for the rear yard beneath the conservatory where the Thopter waited, the craft they had placed there to carry away Paul and his mother. A guard stood at the open rear door of the house, his attention focused on the lighted hall and men banging through there, searching from room to room. How confident they were. Yui hugged the shadows, worked his way around the Thopter, eased open the door on the side away from the guard. He felt under the front seats for the Fremkit he had hidden there, lifted a flap and slipped in the ducal signet. He felt the crinkling of the spice paper there, the note he had written, pressed the ring into the paper. He removed his hand, resealed the pack. Softly, Yui closed the Thopter door, worked his way back to the corner of the house and around toward the flaming trees. Now it is done, he thought. Once more he emerged into the light of the blazing palms. He pulled his cloak around him, stared at the flames. Soon I will know. Soon I will see the Baron, and I will know. And the Baron, he will encounter a small tooth.
There is a legend that the instant the Duke Leto Atreides died, a meteor streaked across the skies above his ancestral palace on Caladan. The Princess Irulan, Introduction to a Child's History of Muad'Dib.
The Baron Vladimir Harkonnen stood at a viewpoint of the grounded lighter he was using as a command post. Out the door he saw the flame-lighted night of Arrakeen. His attention focused on the distant shield wall, where his secret weapon was doing its work. Explosive artillery. The guns nibbled at the caves where the Duke's fighting men had retreated for a last-ditch stand. Slowly measured bites of orange glare, showers of rock and dust in the brief illumination, and the Duke's men were being sealed off to die by starvation, caught like animals in their burrows.
The Baron could feel the distant chomping, a drumbeat carried to him through the ship's metal. Brump, brump, then brump, brump. Who would think of reviving artillery in this day of shields? The thought was a chuckle in his mind, but it was predictable the Duke's men would run for those caves, and the Emperor will appreciate my cleverness in preserving the lives of our mutual force. He adjusted one of the little suspensors that guarded his fat body against the pull of gravity. A smile creased his mouth, pulled at the lines of his jowls. A pity to waste such fighting men as the Duke's, he thought. He smiled more broadly, laughed at himself. Pity should be cruel. He nodded. Failure was, by definition, expendable. The whole universe sat there, open to the man who could make the right decisions. The uncertain rabbits had to be exposed, made to run for their burrows. Else how could you control them and breed them? He pictured his fighting men as bees routing the rabbits, and he thought, the day hums sweetly when you have enough bees working for you. A door opened behind him. The Baron studied the reflection in the night-blackened viewport before turning. Peiter de Vries advanced into the chamber, followed by Amon Kudu, the captain of the Baron's personal guard. There was a motion of men just outside the door, the mutton faces of his guard, their expressions carefully sheep-like in his presence. The Baron turned. Peiter touched finger to forelock in his mocking salute. "Good news, my lord. The Sardaukar have brought in the Duke." "Of course they have," the Baron rumbled. He studied the sombre mask of villainy on Peiter's effeminate face, and the eyes, those shaded slits of bluest blue in blue. Soon I must remove him, the Baron thought. He has almost outlasted his usefulness, almost reached the point of positive danger to my person. First, though, he must make the people of Arrakis hate him. Then they will welcome my darling Feyd-Rautha as a saviour. The Baron shifted his attention to the guard captain, Amon Kudu, scissors line of jaw muscles, chin like a boot toe, a man to be trusted because the captain's vices were known. "First, where is the traitor who gave me the Duke?" the Baron asked. "I must give the traitor his reward." Peiter turned on one toe, motioned to the guard outside. A bit of black movement there, and Yui walked through. His motions were stiff and stringy. The moustache drooped beside his purple lips. Only the old eyes seemed alive. Yui came to a stop 3 paces into the room, obeying a motion from Peiter, and stood there staring across the open space at the Baron. "Ah, Dr. Yui." "My Lord Harkonnen." "You've given us the Duke, I hear." "My half of the bargain, my lord." The Baron looked at Peiter. Peiter nodded. The Baron looked back at Yui. "The letter of the bargain, eh? And I—" He spat the words out. "What was I to do in return?" "You remember quite well, my Lord Harkonnen." And Yui allowed himself to think, now hearing the loud silence of clocks in his mind. He had seen the subtle betrayals in the Baron's manner. Warner was indeed dead, gone far beyond their reach. Otherwise there'd still be a hold on the weak doctor. The Baron's manner showed there was no hold. It was ended. "Do I?" the Baron asked. "You promised to deliver my Warner from her agony." The Baron nodded. "Oh, yes, now I remember, so I did. That was my promise. That was how we bent the Imperial conditioning. You couldn't endure seeing your Bene Gesserit witch grovel in Peiter's pain amplifiers. Well, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen always keeps his promises. I told you I'd free her from the agony and permit you to join her. So be it." He waved a hand at Peiter. Peiter's blue eyes took a glazed look. His movement was cat-like in its sudden fluidity. The knife in his hand glistened like a claw as it flashed into Yui's back. The old man stiffened, never taking his attention from the Baron.
"So join her," the Baron spat.
Yui stood, swaying. His lips moved with careful precision, and his voice came in oddly measured cadence. "You think you defeated me? You think I did not know what I bought for my Wanna?" He toppled. No bending or softening. It was like a tree falling.
"So join her,"
the Baron repeated, but his words were like a weak echo. Yui had filled him with a sense of foreboding. He whipped his attention to Piter, watched the man wipe the blade on a scrap of cloth, watched the creamy look of satisfaction in the blue eyes.
"So that's how he kills by his own hand," the Baron thought. "It's well to know." "He did give us the Duke?" the Baron asked.
"Of a certainty, my lord," Piter said.
"Then get him in here."
Piter glanced at the guard captain, who whirled to obey. The Baron looked down at Yui. From the way the man had fallen, you could suspect oak in him instead of bones.
"I never could bring myself to trust a traitor," the Baron said. "Not even a traitor I created."
He glanced at the night-shrouded viewport. That black bag of stillness out there was his, the Baron knew. There was no more crump of artillery against the shield wall caves. The burrow traps were sealed off. Quite suddenly the Baron's mind could conceive of nothing more beautiful than that utter emptiness of black. Unless it were white on the black, plated white on the black, porcelain white. But there was still the feeling of doubt. What had the old fool of a doctor meant? Of course, he'd probably know what would happen to him in the end, but that bit about thinking he'd been defeated. You think you defeated me. What had he meant? The Duke Leto Atreides came through the door. His arms were bound in chains, the eagle face streaked with dirt. His uniform was torn where someone had ripped off his insignia. There were tatters at his waist where the shield belt had been removed without first freeing the uniform ties. The Duke's eyes held a glazed, insane look.
"Well," the Baron said.
He hesitated, drawing in a deep breath. He knew he had spoken too loudly. This moment, long envisioned, had lost some of its savour.
"Damn that cursed doctor through all eternity."
"I believe the good Duke is drugged," Piter said. "That's how Yui caught him for us." Piter turned to the Duke. "Aren't you drugged, my dear Duke?" The voice was far away. Leto could feel the chains, the ache of muscles, his cracked lips, his burning cheeks, the dry taste of thirst whispering its grit in his mouth. But sounds were dull, hidden by a cottony blanket, and he saw only dim shapes through the blanket.
"What of the woman and the boy, Piter?" the Baron asked. "Any word yet?"
Piter's tongue darted over his lips.
"You've heard something," the Baron snapped. "What?"
Piter glanced at the guard captain, back to the Baron. "The men who were sent to do the job, my lord, they've, been, found."
"Well, they report everything satisfactory?"
"They're dead, my lord."
"Of course they are. What I want to know is—"
"They were dead when found, my lord." The Baron's face went livid.
"And the woman and boy?"
"No sign, my lord, but there was a worm. It came while the scene was being investigated. Perhaps it's as we wished. An accident, possibly."
"We do not deal in possibilities, Piter. What of the missing Thopter? Does that suggest anything to my mentat?"
"One of the Duke's men obviously escaped in it, my lord. Killed our pilot and escaped."
"Which of the Duke's men?"
"It was a clean, silent killing, my lord. Harward, perhaps, or that Halleck one. Possibly Idaho, or any top lieutenant."
"Possibilities,"
the Baron muttered. He glanced at the swaying, drugged figure of the Duke.
"The situation is in hand, my lord," Piter said.
"No, it isn't. Where is that stupid planetologist? Where is this man Kynes?"
"We've word where to find him, and he's been sent for, my lord."
"I don't like the way the Emperor's servant is helping us," the Baron muttered. They were words through a cottony blanket, but some of them burned in Leto's mind. Woman and boy, no sign. Paul and Jessica had escaped, and the fate of Howard, Halleck, and Idaho remained an unknown. There was still hope. "Where is the ducal signet ring?" the Baron demanded. "His finger is bare."
"The Sardaukar say it was not on him when he was taken, my lord," the guard captain said.
"You killed the doctor too soon," the Baron said. "That was a mistake. You should have warned me, Piter. You moved too precipitately for the good of our enterprise." He scowled. Possibilities. The thought hung like a sine wave in Leto's mind. Paul and Jessica have escaped. And there was something else in his memory. A bargain. He could almost remember it. The tooth. He remembered part of it now. A pill of poison gas shaped into a false tooth. Someone had told him to remember the tooth. The tooth was in his mouth. He could feel its shape with his tongue. All he had to do was bite sharply on it. Not yet. The someone had told him to wait until he was near the Baron. Who had told him? He couldn't remember. "How long will he remain drugged like this?" the Baron asked.
"Perhaps another hour, my lord."
"Perhaps,"
the Baron muttered. Again he turned to the night-blackened window.
"I am hungry."
That's the Baron. That fuzzy grey shape there, Leto thought. The shape danced back and forth, swaying with the movement of the room, and the room expanded and contracted. It grew brighter and darker. It folded into blackness and faded. Time became a sequence of layers for the Duke. He drifted up through them. I must wait. There was a table. Leto saw the table quite clearly. And a gross, fat man on the other side of the table, the remains of a meal in front of him. Leto felt himself sitting in a chair across from the fat man, felt the chains, the straps that held his tingling body in the chair. He was aware there had been a passage of time, but its length escaped him. "I believe he's coming around, Baron." A silky voice, that one. That was Piter.
"So I see, Piter."
A rumbling basso. The Baron. Leto sensed increasing definition in his surroundings. The chair beneath him took on firmness. The bindings were sharper. And he saw the Baron clearly now. Leto watched the movements of the man's hands, compulsive touchings, the edge of a plate, the handle of a spoon, a finger tracing the fold of a jowl. Leto watched the moving hand, fascinated by it.
"You can hear me, Duke Leto," the Baron said. "I know you can hear me. We want to know from you where to find your concubine and the child you sired on her."
No sign escaped Leto, but the words were a wash of calmness through him. It's true, then. They don't have Paul and Jessica.
"This is not a child's game we play," the Baron rumbled. "You must know that."
He leaned toward Leto, studying the face. It pained the Baron that this could not be handled privately, just between the two of them. To have others see royalty in such straits, it set a bad precedent. Leto could feel strength returning. And now, the memory of the false tooth stood out in his mind like a steeple in a flat landscape. The nerve-shaped capsule within that tooth, the poison gas. He remembered who had put the deadly weapon in his mouth. Yui. Drug-fogged memory of seeing a limp corpse dragged past him in this room hung like a vapor in Leto's mind. He knew it had been Yui.
"Do you hear that noise, Duke Leto?" the Baron asked.
Leto grew conscious of a frog sound, the bird mewling of someone's agony.
"We caught one of your men disguised as a Fremen," the Baron said. "We penetrated the disguise quite easily. The eyes, you know. He insists he was sent among the Fremen to spy on them. I've lived for a time on this planet, cher cousin. One does not spy on those ragged scum of the desert. Tell me, did you buy their help? Did you send your woman and son to them?" Leto felt fear tighten his chest. If Yui sent them to the desert fold, the search won't stop until they're found. "Come, come," the Baron said. "We don't have much time and pain is quick. Please don't bring it to this, my dear Duke." The Baron looked up at Piter, who stood at Leto's shoulder. "Piter doesn't have all his tools here, but I'm sure he could improvise." "Improvisation is sometimes the best, Baron." That silky, insinuating voice, Leto heard it at his ear. "You had an emergency plan," the Baron said. "Where have your woman and the boy been sent?" He looked at Leto's hand. "Your ring is missing. Does the boy have it?" The Baron looked up, stared into Leto's eyes. "You don't answer," he said. "Will you force me to do a thing I do not want to do?" "Piter will use simple, direct methods. I agree they're sometimes the best, but it's not good that you should be subjected to such things." "Hot tallow on the back, perhaps? Or on the eyelids?" Piter said. "Perhaps on other portions of the body. It's especially effective when the subject doesn't know where the tallow will fall next. It's a good method, and there's a sort of beauty in the pattern of pus-white blisters on naked skin, eh, Baron?" "Exquisite," the Baron said, and his voice sounded sour. Those touching fingers. Leto watched the fat hands, the glittering jewels on baby fat hands, their compulsive wandering. The sounds of agony coming through the door behind him gnawed at the Duke's nerves. Who is it they caught, he wondered. Could it have been Idaho? "Believe me, cher cousin," the Baron said, "I do not want it to come to this." "You think of nerve couriers racing to summon help that cannot come," Piter said. "There's an artistry in this, you know." "You're a superb artist," the Baron growled. "Now, have the decency to be silent." Leto suddenly recalled a thing Gurney Halleck had said once, seeing a picture of the Baron. "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." "We waste time, Baron," Piter said. "Perhaps." The Baron nodded. "You know, my dear Leto, you'll tell us in the end where they are. There's a level of pain that'll buy you." He is most likely correct, Leto thought. Were it not for the tooth, and the fact that I truly don't know where they are. The Baron picked up a sliver of meat, pressed the morsel into his mouth, chewed slowly, swallowed. "We must try a new tack," he thought. "Observe this prize person who denies he's for hire," the Baron said. "Observe him, Piter." And the Baron thought, yes, see him there, this man who believes he cannot be bought. See him detained there by 1,000,000 shares of himself sold in dribbles every second of his life. If you took him up now and shook him, he'd rattle inside, emptied, sold out. What difference how he dies now? The frog sounds in the background stopped. The Baron saw Uman Kudu, the guard captain, appear in the doorway across the room. Shake his head. The captive hadn't produced the needed information. Another failure. Time to quit stalling with this fool Duke, this stupid, soft fool who didn't realize how much hell there was so near him, only a nerve's thickness away. This thought calmed the Baron, overcoming his reluctance to have a royal person subject to pain. He saw himself suddenly as a surgeon, exercising endless supple scissor dissections, cutting away the masks from fools, exposing the hell beneath. Rabbits, all of them. And how they cowered when they saw the carnivore. Leto stared across the table, wondering why he waited. The tooth would end it all quickly. Still, it had been good, much of this life. He found himself remembering an antenna kite up dangling in the shell-blue sky of Caladan, and Paul laughing with joy at the sight of it. And he remembered sunrise here on Arrakis, coloured strata of the shield wall mellowed by dust haze. "Too bad," the Baron muttered. He pushed himself back from the table, stood up lightly in his suspensors and hesitated, seeing a change come over the Duke. He saw the man draw in a deep breath, the jawline stiffen, the ripple of a muscle there as the Duke clamped his mouth shut. "How he fears me," the Baron thought. Shocked by fear that the Baron might escape, Leto bit sharply on the capsule tooth, felt it break. He opened his mouth, expelled the biting vapour he could taste as it formed on his tongue. The Baron grew smaller, a figure seen in a tightening tunnel. Leto heard a gasp beside his ear, the silky-voiced one, Piter. It got him, too. "Piter! What's wrong?" The rumbling voice was far away. Leto sensed memories rolling in his mind, the old toothless mutterings of hags. The room, the table, the Baron, a pair of terrified eyes, blue within blue, the eyes, all compressed around him in ruined symmetry. There was a man with a boot-toe chin, a toy man falling. The toy man had a broken nose, slanted to the left, an offbeat metronome caught forever at the start of an upward stroke. Leto heard the crash of crockery, so distant, a roaring in his ears. His mind was a bin without end, catching everything. Everything that had ever been, every shout, every whisper, every silence. One thought remained to him. Leto saw it in formless light on rays of black. The day the flesh shapes, and the flesh the day shapes. The thought struck him with a sense of fullness he knew he could never explain. Silence. The Baron stood with his back against his private door, his own bolt hole behind the table. He had slammed it on a room full of dead men. His senses took in guards swarming around him. "Did I breathe it?" he asked himself. "Whatever it was in there, did it get me too?" Sounds returned to him, and reason. He heard someone shouting orders, gas masks, "Keep a door closed, get blowers going." The others fell quickly, he thought. "I'm still standing. I'm still breathing. Merciless hell, that was close." He could analyze it now. His shield had been activated, set low but still enough to slow molecular interchange across the field barrier, and he had been pushing himself away from the table, that and Piter's shocked gasp which had brought the guard captain darting forward into his own doom. Chance, and the warning in a dying man's gasp, these had saved him. The Baron felt no gratitude to Piter. The fool had got himself killed, and that stupid guard captain, he'd said he scoped everyone before bringing them into the Baron's presence. How had it been possible for the Duke? No warning. Not even from the poison snooper over the table until it was too late. How? Well, no matter now, the Baron thought, his mind firming. The next guard captain will begin by finding answers to these questions. He grew aware of more activity down the hall, around the corner at the other door to that room of death. The Baron pushed himself away from his own door, studied the lackeys around him. They stood there staring, silent, waiting for the Baron's reaction. Would the Baron be angry? And the Baron realized only a few seconds had passed since his flight from that terrible room. Some of the guards had weapons levelled at the door. Some were directing their ferocity toward the empty hall that stretched away toward the noises around the corner to their right. A man came striding around that corner, gas mask dangling by its straps at his neck, his eyes intent on the overhead poison snoopers that lined this corridor. He was yellow-haired, flat of face, with green eyes. Crisp lines radiated from his thick-lipped mouth. He looked like some water creature, misplaced among those who walked the land. The Baron stared at the approaching man, recalling the name. Nefud. Yakin Nefud, guard corporal. Nefud was addicted to semuta, a drug-music combination that played itself in the deepest consciousness. A useful item of information, that. The man stopped in front of the Baron, saluted. "Corridor's clear, my lord. I was outside watching and saw that it must be poison gas. Ventilators in your room were pulling air in from these corridors." He glanced up at the snooper over the Baron's head. "None of the stuff escaped. We have the room cleaned out now. What are your orders?" The Baron recognized the man's voice, the one who'd been shouting orders. Efficient, this corporal, he thought. "They're all dead in there?" the Baron asked. "Yes, my lord." "Well, we must adjust," the Baron thought. "First," he said, "let me congratulate you, Nefud. You're the new captain of my guard, and I hope you'll take to heart the lesson to be learned from the fate of your predecessor." The Baron watched the awareness grow in his newly promoted guardsman. Nefud knew he'd never again be without his semuta. Nefud nodded. "My lord knows I'll devote myself entirely to his safety." "Yes. Well, to business. I suspect the Duke had something in his mouth. You will find out what that something was, how it was used, who helped him put it there. You'll take every precaution." He broke off, his chain of thought shattered by a disturbance in the corridor behind him. Guards at the door to the lift from the lower levels of the frigate, trying to hold back a tall Colonel Bashar who had just emerged from the lift. The Baron couldn't place the Colonel Bashar's face. Thin, with mouth like a slash in leather, twin ink spots for eyes. "Get your hands off me, you pack of carrion eaters!" the man roared, and he dashed the guards aside. "Ah, one of the Sardaukar," the Baron thought. The Colonel Bashar came striding toward the Baron, whose eyes went to slits of apprehension. The Sardaukar officers filled him with unease. They all seemed to look like relatives of the Duke, the late Duke, and their manners with the Baron. The Colonel Bashar planted himself half a pace in front of the Baron, hands on hips. The guard hovered behind him in twitching uncertainty. The Baron noted the absence of salute, the disdain in the Sardaukar's manner, and his unease grew. There was only the one legion of them, locally. 10 brigades, reinforcing the Harkonnen legions, but the Baron did not fool himself. That one legion was perfectly capable of turning on the Harkonnens and overcoming them. "Tell your men they are not to prevent me from seeing you, Baron," the Sardaukar growled. "My men brought you the Atreides Duke before I could discuss his fate with you. We will discuss it now." "I must not lose face before my men," the Baron thought. "So?" It was a coldly controlled word, and the Baron felt proud of it. "My Emperor has charged me to make certain his royal cousin dies cleanly, without agony," the Colonel Bashar said. "Such were the imperial orders to me," the Baron lied. "Did you think I'd disobey?" "I'm to report to my Emperor what I see with my own eyes," the Sardaukar said. "The Duke's already dead," the Baron snapped, and he waved a hand to dismiss the fellow. The Colonel Bashar remained planted facing the Baron. Not by flicker of eye or muscle did he acknowledge he had been dismissed. "How?" he growled. "Really," the Baron thought, "this is too much." "By his own hand, if you must know," the Baron said. "He took poison." "I will see the body now," the Colonel Bashar said. The Baron raised his gaze to the ceiling in feigned exasperation while his thoughts raced. "Damnation! This sharp-eyed Sardaukar will see the room before a thing's been changed." "Now," the Sardaukar growled. "I'll see it with my own eyes." There was no preventing it, the Baron realized. The Sardaukar would see all. He'd know the Duke had killed Harkonnen men, that the Baron most likely had escaped by a narrow margin. There was the evidence of the dinner remnants on the table, and the dead Duke across from it, with destruction around him. No preventing it at all.
"I'll not be put off," the Colonel Basha snarled. "You're not being put off," the Baron said, and he stared into the Sardaukar's obsidian eyes. "I hide nothing from my Emperor."
He nodded to Nefud.
"The Colonel Bashar is to see everything at once. Take him in by the door where you stood, Nefud."
"This way, sir," Nefud said. Slowly, insolently, the Sardaukar moved around the Baron, shouldered away through the guardsmen. Insufferable, the Baron thought. Now the Emperor will know how I slipped up. He'll recognize it as a sign of weakness. And it was agonizing to realize that the Emperor and his Sardaukar were alike in their disdain for weakness. The Baron chewed at his lower lip, consoling himself that the Emperor at least had not learned of the Atreides' raid on Gedi Prime, the destruction of the Harkonnen spice stores there. Damn that slippery Duke! The Baron watched the retreating backs, the arrogant Sardaukar and the stocky, efficient Nefud. We must adjust, the Baron thought. I'll have to put Raban over this damnable planet once more. Without restraint, I must spread my own Harkonnen blood to put Arrakis into a proper condition for accepting Fade Routher. Damn that Piter! He would get himself killed before I was through with him. The Baron sighed. And I must send at once to Tleilax for a new Mentat. They undoubtedly have the new one ready for me by now. One of the guardsmen beside him coughed. The Baron turned toward the man. I'm hungry. Yes, my lord. And I wish to be diverted while you're clearing out that room and studying its secrets for me. The Baron rumbled. The guardsman lowered his eyes. What diversion does my lord wish? I'll be in my sleeping chambers, the Baron said. Bring me that young fellow we bought on Gamont, the one with the lovely eyes. Drug him well. I don't feel like wrestling. Yes, my lord. The Baron turned away, began moving with his bouncing, suspensor-buoyed pace toward his chambers. Yes, he thought, the one with the lovely eyes. The one who looks so much like the young Paul Atreides.
O seas of Caladan, O people of Duke Leto, citadel of Leto fallen, fallen forever. From Songs of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
Paul felt that all his past, every experience before this night, had become sand, curling in an hourglass. He sat near his mother, hugging his knees within a small fabric and plastic hutment, a still tent that had come, like the Fremen clothing they now wore, from the pack left in the Thopter. There was no doubt in Paul's mind who had put the Fremkit there, who had directed the course of the Thopter carrying them captive. Yueh. The traitor doctor had sent them directly into the hands of Duncan Idaho. Paul stared out the transparent end of the still tent at the moon-shadowed rocks that ringed this place where Idaho had hidden them. Hidden like a child when I'm now the Duke, Paul thought. He felt the thought gall him, but he could not deny the wisdom in what they did. Something had happened to his awareness this night. He saw with sharpened clarity every circumstance and occurrence around him. He felt unable to stop the inflow of data or the cold precision with which each new item was added to his knowledge, and the computation was centered in his awareness. It was Mentat power and more. Paul thought back to the moment of impotent rage as the strange Thopter dived out of the night onto them, swooping like a giant hawk above the desert with wind screaming through its wings. The thing in Paul's mind had happened then. The Thopter had skidded and slewed across a sand ridge toward the running figures, his mother and himself. Paul remembered how the smell of burned sulphur from abrasion of Thopter skids against sand had drifted across them. His mother, he knew, had turned, expected to meet a lasgun in the hands of Harkonnen mercenaries, and had recognized Duncan Idaho leaning out the Thopter's open door, shouting, "Hurry! There's worm sign south of you!" But Paul had known as he turned who piloted the Thopter. An accumulation of minutiae in the way it was flown, the dash of the landing, clues so small even his mother hadn't detected them, had told Paul precisely who sat at those controls. Across the still tent from Paul, Jessica stirred, said, "There can be only one explanation. The Harkonnens held Yui's wife. He hated the Harkonnens. I cannot be wrong about that. You read his note. But why has he saved us from the carnage?" She is only now seeing it, and that poorly, Paul thought. The thought wasn't a shock. He had known this fact as a by-the-way thing while reading the note that had accompanied the ducal signet in the pack. "Do not try to forgive me," Yui had written. "I do not want your forgiveness. I already have enough burdens. What I have done was done without malice or hope of another's understanding. It is my own Tahadi al-Burhan, my ultimate test. I give you the Atreides ducal signet as token that I write truly. By the time you read this, Duke Leto will be dead. Take consolation from my assurance that he did not die alone, that one we hate above all others died with him." It had not been addressed or signed, but there'd been no mistaking the familiar scrawl. Yui's. Remembering the letter, Paul re-examined the distress of that moment, a thing sharp and strange that seemed to happen outside his new mental alertness. He had read that his father was dead, known the truth of the words, but had felt them as no more than another datum to be entered in his mind and used. I loved my father, Paul thought, and knew this for truth. I should mourn him. I should feel something. But he felt nothing except, here's an important fact. It was one with all the other facts. All the while his mind was adding sense impressions, extrapolating, computing. Halleck's words came back to Paul. "Mood's a thing for cattle or for making love. You fight when the necessity arises, no matter your mood." Perhaps that's it, Paul thought. I'll mourn my father later, when there's time. But he felt no let-up in the cold precision of his being. He sensed that his new awareness was only a beginning, that it was growing. The sense of terrible purpose he'd first experienced in his ordeal with the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayam pervaded him. His right hand, the hand of remembered pain, tingled and throbbed. Is this what it is to be the Kwisatz Haderach? He wondered. For a while I thought Howard had failed us again, Jessica said. I thought perhaps Yui wasn't a Suk doctor. He was everything we thought him, and more, Paul said. And he thought, why is she so slow seeing these things? He said, if Idaho doesn't get through to Kynes, we'll be... He's not our only hope, she said. Such was not my suggestion, he said. She heard the steel in his voice, the sense of command, and stared across the grey darkness of the still tent at him. Paul was a silhouette against moon-frosted rocks, seen through the tent's transparent end. Others among your father's men will have escaped, she said. We must regather them, find... We will depend upon ourselves, he said. Our immediate concern is our family atomics. We must get them before the Harkonnens can search them out. Not likely they'll be found, she said, the way they were hidden. It must not be left to chance. And she thought, blackmail with the family atomics as a threat to the planet and its spice, that's what he has in mind. But all he can hope for then is escape into renegade anonymity. His mother's words had provoked another train of thought in Paul, a duke's concern for all the people they'd lost this night. People are the true strength of a great house, Paul thought. And he remembered Howard's words. Parting with people is a sadness. A place is only a place. They're using Sarduka. Jessica said. "We must wait until the Sardaukar have been withdrawn." "They think us caught between the desert and the Sardaukar," Paul said. "They intend that there be no Atreides survivors. Total extermination. Do not count on any of our people escaping." "They cannot go on indefinitely risking exposure of the Emperor's part in this." "Can't they?" "Some of our people are bound to escape." "Are they?" Jessica turned away, frightened of the bitter strength in her son's voice, hearing the precise assessment of chances. She sensed that his mind had leaped ahead of her, that it now saw more in some respects than she did. She had helped train the intelligence which did this, but now she found herself fearful of it. Her thoughts turned, seeking toward the lost sanctuary of her duke, and tears burned her eyes. "This is the way it had to be later," she thought. "A time of love and a time of grief." She rested her hand on her abdomen, awareness focused on the embryo there. "I have the Atreides daughter I was ordered to produce. But the Reverend Mother was wrong. A daughter wouldn't have saved my Leto. This child is only life reaching for the future in the midst of death. I conceived out of instinct, and not out of obedience." "Try the Communinet receiver again," Paul said. "The mind goes on working no matter how we try to hold it back," she thought. Jessica found the tiny receiver Idaho had left for them, flipped its switch. A green light glowed on the instrument's face. Tinny screeching came from its speaker. She reduced the volume, hunted across the bands. A voice speaking Atreides battle language came into the tent. "Pack and regroup at the ridge. Fedor reports no survivors in Carthag, and the guild bank has been sacked." Carthag, Jessica thought. That was a Harkonnen hotbed. "They're Sardaukar," the voice said. "Watch out for Sardaukar in Atreides uniforms. They're—" A roaring filled the speaker. Then silence. "Try the other bands," Paul said. "Do you realize what that means?" Jessica asked. "I expected it. They want the guild to blame us for destruction of their bank. With the guild against us, we are trapped on Arrakis. Try the other bands." She weighed his words. I expected it. What had happened to him? Slowly, Jessica returned to the instrument. As she moved the band slide, they caught glimpses of violence in the few voices calling out in Atreides battle language. "Fall back! Try to regroup it! Trapped in a cave at—" And there was no mistaking the victorious exultation in the Harkonnen gibberish that poured from the other bands. Sharp commands, battle reports. There wasn't enough of it for Jessica to register and break the language, but the tone was obvious. Harkonnen victory. Paul shook the pack beside him, hearing the 2 litre-johns of water gurgle there. He took a deep breath, looked up through the transparent end of the tent at the rock escarpment outlined against the stars. His left hand felt the sphincter seal of the tent's entrance. "It'll be dawn soon," he said. "We can wait through the day for Idaho, but not through another night. In the desert you must travel by night and rest in shade through the day." Remembered lore insinuated itself into Jessica's mind. Without a stillsuit, a man sitting in shade on the desert needs 5 liters of water a day to maintain body weight. She felt the slick, soft skin of the stillsuit against her body, thinking how their lives depended on these garments. "If we leave here, Idaho can't find us," she said. "There are ways to make any man talk," he said. "If Idaho hasn't returned by dawn, we must consider the possibility he has been captured. How long do you think he could hold out?" The question required no answer, and she sat in silence. Paul lifted the seal on the pack, pulled out a tiny micro-manual with glow tab and magnifier. Green and orange letters leaped up at him from the pages. Litter-johns, still tent, energy caps, recaths, sand snork, binoculars, stillsuit rep kit, Baradai pistol, sync chart, filt plugs, paracompass, maker hooks, thumpers, frem kit, fire pillar. So many things for survival on the desert. Presently he put the manual aside on the tent floor. "Where can we possibly go?" Jessica asked. "My father spoke of desert power," Paul said. "The Harkonnens cannot rule this planet without it. They've never ruled this planet, nor shall they. Not even with 10,000 legions of Sarduka. Paul, you can't think that— We've all the evidence in our hands, he said. Right here in this tent. The tent itself, this pack and its contents, these still suits. We know the Guild wants a prohibitive price for weather satellites. We know that— What have weather satellites got to do with it? She asked. They couldn't possibly— She broke off. Paul sensed the hyper-alertness of his mind reading her reactions, computing on minutiae. You see it now, he said. Satellites watch the terrain below. There are things in the deep desert that will not bear frequent inspection. You're suggesting the Guild itself controls this planet? She was so slow. No, he said. The Fremen. They're paying the Guild for privacy. Paying in a coin that's freely available to anyone with desert power. Spice. This is more than a second approximation answer. It's the straight-line computation. Depend on it. Paul, Jessica said, you're not a Mentat yet. You can't know for sure how— I'll never be a Mentat, he said. I'm something else. A freak. Paul, how can you say such— Leave me alone! He turned away from her, looking out into the night. Why can't I mourn? He wondered. He felt that every fibre of his being craved this release, but it would be denied him forever. Jessica had never heard such distress in her son's voice. She wanted to reach out to him, hold him, comfort him, help him, but she sensed there was nothing she could do. He had to solve this problem by himself. The glowing tab of the Fremkit manual between them on the tent floor caught her eye. She lifted it, glanced at the flyleaf, reading, Manual of the Friendly Desert, the place full of life. Here are the ayat and burhan of life. Believe, and Allah shall never burn you. It reads like the Ajar book, she thought, recalling her studies of the great secrets. Has a manipulator of religions been on Arrakis? Paul lifted the paracampus from the pack, returned it, said, Think of all these special application Fremen machines. They show unrivaled sophistication. Admit it. The culture that made these things betrays depths no one suspected. Hesitating, still worried by the harshness in his voice, Jessica returned to the book, studied an illustrated constellation from the Arakeen sky. Muad'Dib, the mouse, and noted that the tail pointed north. Paul stared into the tense darkness at the dimly discerned movements of his mother, revealed by the manual's glow tab. Now is the time to carry out my father's wish, he thought. I must give her his message now while she has time for grief. Grief would inconvenience us later. And he found himself shocked by precise logic. Mother, he said. Yes. She heard the change in his voice, felt coldness in her entrails at the sound. Never had she heard such harsh control. My father is dead, he said. She searched within herself for the coupling of fact and fact and fact, the Bene Gesserit way of assessing data, and it came to her, the sensation of terrifying loss. Jessica nodded, unable to speak. My father charged me once, Paul said, to give you a message if anything happened to him. He feared you might believe he distrusted you. That useless suspicion, she thought. He wanted you to know he never suspected you, Paul said, and explained the deception, adding, he wanted you to know he always trusted you completely, always loved you and cherished you. He said he would sooner have mistrusted himself, and he had but one regret, that he never made you his duchess. She brushed the tears coursing down her cheeks, thought, what a stupid waste of the body's water. But she knew this thought for what it was, the attempt to retreat from grief into anger. Leto, my Leto, she thought. What terrible things we do to those we love. With a violent motion she extinguished the little manual's glow tab. Sobs shook her. Paul heard his mother's grief and felt the emptiness within himself. I have no grief, he thought. Why? Why? He felt the inability to grieve as a terrible flaw. A time to get and time to lose, Jessica thought, quoting to herself from the O.C. Bible. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time for love and a time to hate. A time of war and a time of peace. Paul's mind had gone on in its chilling precision. He saw the avenues ahead of them on this hostile planet. Without even the safety valve of dreaming, he focused his prescient awareness, seeing it as a computation of most probable futures, but with something more, an edge of mystery, as though his mind dipped into some timeless stratum and sampled the winds of the future. Abruptly, as though he had found a necessary key, Paul's mind climbed another notch in awareness. He felt himself clinging to this new level, clutching at a precarious hold and peering about. It was as though he existed within a globe, with avenues radiating away in all directions, yet this only approximated the sensation. He remembered once seeing a gauze kerchief blowing in the wind, and now he sensed the future as though it twisted across some surface as undulant and impermanent as that of the wind-blown kerchief. He saw people. He felt the heat and cold of uncounted probabilities. He knew names and places, experienced emotions without number, reviewed data of innumerable unexplored crannies. There was time to probe, and test, and taste, but no time to shape. The thing was a spectrum of possibilities from the most remote past to the most remote future, from the most probable to the most improbable. He saw his own death in countless ways. He saw new planets, new cultures, people. People. He saw them in such swarms they could not be listed, yet his mind catalogued them. Even the guildsmen. And he thought, the guild. There'd be a way for us, my strangeness accepted, as a familiar thing of high value, always with an assured supply of the now necessary spice. But the idea of living out his life in the mind groping ahead through possible futures that guided hurtling spaceships appalled him. It was a way, though, and in meeting the possible future that contained guildsmen, he recognized his own strangeness. I have another kind of sight. I see another kind of terrain. The available paths. The awareness conveyed both reassurance and alarm. So many places on that other kind of terrain dipped or turned out of his sight. As swiftly as it had come, the sensation slipped away from him, and he realized the entire experience had taken the space of a heartbeat. Yet his own personal awareness had been turned over, illuminated in a terrifying way. He stared around him. Night still covered the still tent within its rock-enclosed hideaway. His mother's grief could still be heard. His own lack of grief could still be felt, that hollow place somewhere separated from his mind, which went on in its steady pace, dealing with data, evaluating, computing, submitting answers in something like the Mentat way. And now he saw that he had a wealth of data few such minds ever before had encompassed. But this made the empty place within him no easier to bear. He felt that something must shatter. It was as though a clockwork control for a bomb had been set to ticking within him. It went on about its business no matter what he wanted. It recorded minuscule shadings of difference around him, a slight change in moisture, a fractional fall in temperature, the progress of an insect across their still tent roof, the solemn approach of dawn in the star-lighted patch of sky he could see out the tent's transparent end. The emptiness was unbearable. Knowing how the clockwork had been set in motion made no difference. He could look to his own past and see the start of it, The training, the sharpening of talents, the refined pressures of sophisticated disciplines, even exposure to the OC Bible at a critical moment. And, lastly, the heavy intake of spice. And he could look ahead, the most terrifying direction, to see where it all pointed. "I'm a monster," he thought. "A freak." "No," he said. Then, "No! No! No!" He found that he was pounding the tent floor with his fists. The implacable part of him recorded this as an interesting emotional datum, and fed it into computation. "Paul!" His mother was beside him, holding his hands, her face a grey blob peering at him. "Paul, what's wrong?" "You," he said. "I'm here, Paul," she said. "It's all right." "What have you done to me?" he demanded. In a burst of clarity, she sensed some of the roots in the question, said, "I gave birth to you." It was, from instinct as much as her own subtle knowledge, the precisely correct answer to calm him. He felt her hands holding him, focused on the dim outline of her face. Certain gene traces in her facial structure were noted in the new way by his on-flowing mind, the clues added to other data, and a final summation answer put forward. "Let go of me," he said. She heard the iron in his voice, obeyed. "Do you want to tell me what's wrong, Paul?" "Did you know what you were doing when you trained me?" he asked. There's no more childhood in his voice, she thought. And she said, "I hoped the thing any parent hopes, that you'd be superior, different." "Different?" She heard the bitterness in his tone, said, "Paul, You didn't want a son," he said. "You wanted a Kwisatz Haderach. You wanted a male Bene Gesserit." She recoiled from his bitterness. "But, Paul, did you ever consult my father in this?" She spoke gently out of the freshness of her grief. "Whatever you are, Paul, the heredity is as much your father as me." "But not the training," he said. "Not the things that awakened the sleeper." "Sleeper?" "It's here." He put a hand to his head and then to his breast. "In me. It goes on and on and on and on and Paul!" She had heard the hysteria edging his voice. "Listen to me," he said. "You wanted the Reverend Mother to hear about my dreams. You listen in her place now. I've just had a waking dream. Do you know why?" "You must calm yourself," she said. "If there's—" "The spice," he said. "It's in everything here. The air, the soil, the food. The geriatric spice. It's like the truth-sayer drug. It's a poison." She stiffened. His voice lowered, and he repeated, "A poison. So subtle, so insidious, so irreversible, it won't even kill you unless you stop taking it. We can't leave Arrakis unless we take part of Arrakis with us." The terrifying presence of his voice brooked no dispute. "You and the spice," Paul said. "The spice changes anyone who gets this much of it, but thanks to you, I could bring the change to consciousness. I don't get to leave it in the unconscious where its disturbance can be blanked out. I can see it." "Paul, you—" "I see it," he repeated. She heard madness in his voice, didn't know what to do. But he spoke again, and she heard the iron control return to him. "We're trapped here." "We're trapped here," she agreed. And she accepted the truth of his words. No pressure of the Bene Gesserit, no trickery or artifice could pry them completely free from Arrakis. The spice was addictive. Her body had known the fact long before her mind awakened to it. "So here we live out our lives," she thought, "on this hell planet. The place is prepared for us, if we can evade the Harkonnens, and there's no doubt of my course. A brood mare preserving an important bloodline for the Bene Gesserit plan." "I must tell you about my waking dream," Paul said. Now there was fury in his voice. "To be sure you accept what I say, I'll tell you first, I know you'll bear a daughter, my sister, here on Arrakis." Jessica placed her hands against the tent floor, pressed back against the curving fabric wall to still a pang of fear. She knew her pregnancy could not show yet. Only her own Bene Gesserit training had allowed her to read the first, faint signals of her body, to know of the embryo only a few weeks old.
"Only to serve,"
Jessica whispered, clinging to the Bene Gesserit motto.
"We exist only to serve."
"We'll find a home among the Fremen," Paul said. "Your Missionaria Protectiva has brought us a bolt hole."
"They've prepared a way for us in the desert," Jessica told herself. But how can he know the Missionaria Protectiva?
She found it increasingly difficult to subdue her terror at the overpowering strangeness in Paul. He studied the dark shadow of her, seeing her fear and every reaction with his new awareness, as though she were outlined in blinding light. A beginning of compassion for her crept over him. "The things that can happen here I cannot begin to tell you," he said. "I cannot even begin to tell myself, although I've seen them. This sense of the future, I seem to have no control over it. The thing just happens. The immediate future, say a year, I can see some of that. A road as broad as our central avenue on Caladan. Some places I don't see, shadowed places, as though it went behind a hill." And again he thought of the surface of a blowing kerchief. "And there are branchings." He fell silent as memory of that seeing filled him. No prescient dream, no experience of his life had quite prepared him for the totality with which the veils had been ripped away to reveal naked time. Recalling the experience, he recognized his own terrible purpose, the pressure of his life spreading outward like an expanding bubble. Time retreating before it. Jessica found the tent's glow tab control, activated it. Dim green light drove back the shadows, easing her fear. She looked at Paul's face, his eyes, the inward stare, and she knew where she had seen such a look before, pictured in records of disasters, on the faces of children who experienced starvation or terrible injury. The eyes were like pits, mouth a straight line, cheeks indrawn. "It's the look of terrible awareness," she thought, of someone forced to the knowledge of his own mortality. He was indeed no longer a child. The underlying import of his words began to take over in her mind, pushing all else aside. Paul could see ahead, a way of escape for them.
"There's a way to evade the Harkonnens," she said.
"The Harkonnens," he sneered. "Put those twisted humans out of your mind." He stared at his mother, studying the lines of her face in the light of the glow tab. The lines betrayed her. She said,
"You shouldn't refer to people as humans without—"
"Don't be so sure you know where to draw the line," he said. "We carry our past with us, and, mother mine, there's a thing you don't know, and should. We are Harkonnens." Her mind did a terrifying thing. It blanked out, as though it needed to shut off all sensation. But Paul's voice went on at that implacable pace, dragging her with it. "When next you find a mirror, study your face. Study mine now. The traces are there if you don't blind yourself. Look at my hands, the set of my bones. If none of this convinces you, then take my word for it. I've walked the future. I've looked at a record. I've seen a place. I have all the data. We're Harkonnens."
"A renegade branch of the family," she said. "That's it, isn't it? Some Harkonnen cousin who—"
"You're the Baron's own daughter," he said, and watched the way she pressed her hands to her mouth. "The Baron sampled many pleasures in his youth, and once permitted himself to be seduced. But it was for the genetic purposes of the Bene Gesserit, by one of you." The way he said "you" struck her like a slap, but it set her mind to working, and she could not deny his words. So many blank ends of meaning in her past reached out now and linked. The daughter the Bene Gesserit wanted, It wasn't to end the old Atreides-Harkonnen feud, but to fix some genetic factor in their lines. What? She groped for an answer. As though he saw inside her mind, Paul said, "They thought they were reaching for me, but I'm not what they expected, and I've arrived before my time. And they don't know it." Jessica pressed her hands to her mouth. "Great Mother, he's the Kwisatz Haderach." She felt exposed and naked before him, realizing then that he saw her with eyes from which little could be hidden, and that, she knew, was the basis of her fear. "You're thinking I'm the Kwisatz Haderach," she said. "Put that out of your mind. I'm something unexpected." "I must get the word out to one of the schools," she thought. "The mating index may show what has happened." "They won't learn about me until it's too late," he said. She sought to divert him, lowered her hands, and said, "We'll find a place among the Fremen." "The Fremen have a saying they credit to Shai Hulud, Old Father Eternity," he said. "They say, 'Be prepared to appreciate what you meet.'" And he thought, "Yes, mother mine, among the Fremen. You'll acquire the blue eyes and a callus beside your lovely nose from the filter tube to your still suit. And you'll bear my sister, St. Alia of the Knife." "If you're not the Kwisatz Haderach," Jessica said, "what?" "You couldn't possibly know," he said. "You won't believe it until you see it." And he thought, "I'm a seed." He suddenly saw how fertile was the ground into which he had fallen, and with this realization the terrible purpose filled him, creeping through the empty place within, threatening to choke him with grief. He had seen two main branchings along the way ahead. In one he confronted an evil old baron and said, "Hello, grandfather." He thought of that path, and what lay along it sickened him. The other path held long patches of grey obscurity, except for peaks of violence. He had seen a warrior religion there, a fire spreading across the universe with the Atreides' green and black banner waving at the head of fanatic legions drunk on spice liquor. Gurney Halleck and a few others of his father's men, a pitiful few, were among them, all marked by the hawk symbol from the shrine of his father's skull. "I can't go that way," he muttered. "That's what the old witches of your schools really want." "I don't understand you, Paul," his mother said. He remained silent, thinking like the seed he was, thinking with the race consciousness he had first experienced as terrible purpose. He found that he no longer could hate the Bene Gesserit, or the Emperor, or even the Harkonnens. They were all caught up in the need of their race to renew its scattered inheritance, to cross and mingle and infuse their bloodlines in a great new pooling of genes, and the race knew only one sure way for this: the ancient way, the tried and certain way that rolled over everything in its path. Jihad. "Surely I cannot choose that way," he thought. But he saw again in his mind's eye the shrine of his father's skull, and the violence with the green and black banner waving in its midst. Jessica cleared her throat, worried by his silence. "Then the Fremen will give us sanctuary?" He looked up, staring across the green-lighted tent at the inbred patrician lines of her face. "Yes," he said. "That's one of the ways." He nodded. "Yes. They'll call me Muad'Dib, the one who points the way. Yes, that's what they'll call me." And he closed his eyes, thinking, "Now, my father, I can mourn you." And he felt the tears coursing down his cheeks. Book 2. Muad'Dib.
When my father, the Padishah Emperor, heard of Duke Leto's death and the manner of it, he went into such a rage as we had never before seen. He blamed my mother and the compact forced on him to place a Bene Gesserit on the throne. He blamed the guild and the evil old baron. He blamed everyone in sight, not excepting even me, for he said I was a witch like all the others. And when I sought to comfort him, saying it was done according to an older law of self-preservation, to which even the most ancient rulers gave allegiance, he sneered at me and asked if I thought him a weakling. I saw then that he had been aroused to this passion not by concern over the dead duke, but by what that death implied for all royalty. As I look back on it, I think there may have been some prescience in my father too, for it is certain that his line and Muad'Dib's shared common ancestry. In my father's house by the Princess Irulan.
Now Harkonnen shall kill Harkonnen, Paul whispered. He had awakened shortly before nightfall, sitting up in the sealed and darkened still tent. As he spoke, he heard the vague stirrings of his mother, where she slept against the tent's opposite wall. Paul glanced at the proximity detector on the floor, studying the dials illuminated in the blackness by phosphor tubes. "It should be night soon," his mother said. "Why don't you lift the tent shades?" Paul realized then that her breathing had been different for some time, that she had lain silent in the darkness until certain he was awake. "Lifting the shades wouldn't help," he said. "There's been a storm. The tent's covered by sand. I'll dig us out soon." "No sign of Duncan yet?" "None." Paul rubbed absently at the ducal signet on his thumb, and a sudden rage against the very substance of this planet, which had helped kill his father, set him trembling. "I heard the storm begin," Jessica said. The undemanding emptiness of her words helped restore some of his calm. His mind focused on the storm as he had seen it begin through the transparent end of their still tent. Cold dribbles of sand crossing the basin, then runnels and tails furrowing the sky. He had looked up to a rock spire, seen it change shape under the blast, becoming a low, cheddar-coloured wedge. Sand funneled into their basin had shadowed the sky with dull curry, then blotted out all light as the tent was covered. Tent bows had creaked once as they accepted the pressure, then silence, broken only by the dim bellows wheezing of their sand snorkel pumping air from the surface. "Try the receiver again," Jessica said. "No use," he said. He found his stillsuit's water tube in its clip at his neck, drew a warm swallow into his mouth, and he thought that here he truly began an Arakeen existence, living on reclaimed moisture from his own breath and body. It was flat and tasteless water, but it soothed his throat. Jessica heard Paul drinking, felt the slickness of her own still suit clinging to her body, but she refused to accept her thirst. To accept it would require awakening fully into the terrible necessities of Arrakis, where they must guard even fractional traces of moisture, hoarding the few drops in the tent's catch pockets, begrudging a breath wasted on the open air. So much easier to drift back down into sleep. But there had been a dream in this day's sleep, and she shivered at the memory of it. She had held dreaming hands beneath sandflow where a name had been written, Duke Leto Atreides. The name had blurred with the sand, and she had moved to restore it, but the first letter filled before the last was begun. The sand would not stop. Her dream became wailing, louder and louder, that ridiculous wailing. Part of her mind had realized the sound was her own voice as a tiny child, little more than a baby. A woman not quite visible to memory was going away. My unknown mother, Jessica thought. The Bene Gesserit who bore me and gave me to the sisters because that's what she was commanded to do. Was she glad to rid herself of a Harkonnen child? "The place to hit them is in the spice," Paul said. How can he think of attack at a time like this? She asked herself. An entire planet full of spice, she said. How can you hit them there? She heard him stirring, the sound of their pack being dragged across the tent floor. "It was sea power and air power on Caladan," he said. "Here it's desert power. The Fremen are the key." His voice came from the vicinity of the tent's sphincter. Her Bene Gesserit training sensed in his tone an unresolved bitterness toward her. All his life he has been trained to hate Harkonnens, she thought. Now he finds he is Harkonnen. Because of me. How little he knows me. I was my Duke's only woman. I accepted his life and his values, even to defying my Bene Gesserit orders. The tent's glow tab came alight under Paul's hand, filled the domed area with green radiance. Paul crouched at the sphincter, his stillsuit hood adjusted for the open desert, forehead capped, mouth filter in place, nose plugs adjusted. Only his dark eyes were visible, a narrow band of face that turned once toward her and away. "Secure yourself for the open," he said, and his voice was blurred behind the filter. Jessica pulled the filter across her mouth, began adjusting her hood as she watched Paul break the tent seal. Sand rasped as he opened the sphincter, and a bird fizzle of grains ran into the tent before he could immobilize it with a static compaction tool. A hole grew in the sand wall as the tool realigned the grains. He slipped out, and her ears followed his progress to the surface. "What will we find out there?" she wondered. "Harkonnen troops and the Sardaukar? Those are dangers we can expect. But what of the dangers we don't know?" She thought of the compaction tool and the other strange instruments in the pack. Each of these tools suddenly stood in her mind as a sign of mysterious dangers. She felt then a hot breeze from surface sand touch her cheeks where they were exposed above the filter. "Pass up the pack." It was Paul's voice, low and guarded. She moved to obey, heard the water liter-johns gurgle as she shoved the pack across the floor. She peered upward, saw Paul framed against stars. "Here," he said, and reached down, pulled the pack to the surface. Now she saw only the circle of stars. They were like the luminous tips of weapons aimed down at her. A shower of meteors crossed her patch of night. The meteors seemed to her like a warning, like tiger stripes, like luminous grave slats clabbering her blood. And she felt the chill of the price on their heads. "Hurry up," Paul said. "I want to collapse the tent." A shower of sand from the surface brushed her left hand. How much sand will the hand hold? She asked herself. "Shall I help you?" Paul asked. "No." She swallowed in a dry throat, slipped into the hole, felt static, packed sand rasp under her hands. Paul reached down, took her arm. She stood beside him on a smooth patch of starlit desert, stared around. Sand almost brimmed their basin, leaving only a dim lip of surrounding rock. She probed the farther darkness with her trained senses. Noise of small animals. Birds. A fall of dislodged sand and faint creature sounds within it. Paul collapsing their tent, recovering it up the hole. Starlight displaced just enough of the night to charge each shadow with menace. She looked at patches of blackness. Black is blind remembering, she thought. You listen for pack sounds, for the cries of those who hunted your ancestors in a past so ancient only your most primitive cells remember. The ears see, the nostrils see. Presently Paul stood beside her, said, "Duncan told me that if he was captured, he could hold out this long. We must leave here now." He shouldered the pack, crossed to the shallow lip of the basin, climbed to a ledge that looked down on open desert. Jessica followed automatically, noting how she now lived in her son's orbit. "For now is my grief heavier than the sands of the seas," she thought. "This world has emptied me of all but the oldest purpose, tomorrow's life. I live now for my young Duke, and the daughter yet to be." She felt the sand drag her feet as she climbed to Paul's side. He looked north across a line of rocks, studying a distant escarpment. The faraway rock profile was like an ancient battleship of the seas outlined by stars. The long swish of it lifted on an invisible wave with syllables of boomerang antennae, funnels arching back, a pie-shaped up-thrusting at the stern. An orange glare burst above the silhouette, and a line of brilliant purple cut downward toward the glare. Another line of purple, and another up-thrusting orange glare. It was like an ancient naval battle, remembered shellfire, and the sight held them staring. "Pillars of fire," Paul whispered. A ring of red eyes lifted over the distant rock. Lines of purple laced the sky. "Jet flares and laser guns," Jessica said. The dust-reddened first moon of Arrakis lifted above the horizon to their left, and they saw a storm trail there, a ribbon of movement over the desert. "It must be Harkonnen Thopters hunting us," Paul said, "the way they're cutting up the desert. It's as though they were making certain they stamped out whatever's there, the way you'd stamp out a nest of insects." "Or a nest of Atreides," Jessica said. "We must seek cover," Paul said. "We'll head south and keep to the rocks. If they caught us in the open..." He turned, adjusting the pack to his shoulders. "They're killing anything that moves." He took one step along the ledge and, in that instant, heard the low hiss of gliding aircraft, saw the dark shapes of ornithopters above them.
My father once told me that respect for the truth comes close to being the basis for all morality. Something cannot emerge from nothing, he said. This is profound thinking if you understand how unstable the truth can be. From Conversations with Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan.
I've always prided myself on seeing things the way they truly are. That's the curse of being a Mentat. You can't stop analyzing your data.
The leathered old face of Thufir Hawat appeared composed in the pre-dawn dimness as he spoke. His sappho-stained lips were drawn into a straight line, with radial creases spreading upward. A robed man squatted silently on sand across from Hawat, apparently unmoved by the words. The two crouched beneath a rock overhang that looked down on a wide, shallow sink. Dawn was spreading over the shattered outline of cliffs across the basin, touching everything with pink. It was cold under the overhang, a dry and penetrating chill left over from the night. There had been a warm wind just before dawn, but now it was cold. Hawat could hear teeth chattering behind him among the few troopers remaining in his force. The man squatting across from Hawat was a Fremen who had come across the sink in the first light of false dawn, skittering over the sand, blending into the dunes, his movements barely discernible. The Fremen extended a finger to the sand between them, drew a figure there. It looked like a bowl with an arrow spilling out of it.
"There are many Harkonnen patrols."
He lifted his finger, pointed upward across the cliffs that Hawat and his men had descended. Hawat nodded. Many patrols, yes. But still he did not know what this Fremen wanted, and this rankled. Mentat training was supposed to give a man the power to see motives. This had been the worst night of Hawat's life. He had been at Simpo, a garrison village, buffer outpost for the former capital city Carthage, when the reports of attack began arriving. At first he thought, it's a raid. The Harkonnens are testing. But report followed report, faster and faster. 2 legions landed at Carthage, 5 legions, 50 brigades, attacking the Duke's main base at Arrakeen, a legion at Arsunt, 2 battle groups at Splintered Rock. Then the reports became more detailed. There were Imperial Sardaukar among the attackers, possibly 2 legions of them. And it became clear that the invaders knew precisely which weight of arms to send where. Precisely. Superb intelligence. Hawat's shocked fury had mounted until it threatened the smooth functioning of his Mentat capabilities. The size of the attack struck his mind like a physical blow. Now, Hiding beneath a bit of desert rock, he nodded to himself, pulled his torn and slashed tunic around him as though warding off the cold shadows. The size of the attack. He had always expected their enemy to hire an occasional lighter from the guild for probing raids. That was an ordinary enough gambit in this kind of house-to-house warfare. Lighters landed and took off on Arrakis regularly to transport the spice for House Atreides. Hawat had taken precautions against random raids by false spice lighters. For a full attack, they'd expected no more than 10 brigades. But there were more than 2,000 ships down on Arrakis at the last count. Not just lighters, but frigates, scouts, monitors, crushers, troop carriers, dump boxes. More than 100 brigades, 10 legions. The entire spice income of Arrakis for 50 years might just cover the cost of such a venture. It might. I underestimated what the Baron was willing to spend in attacking us, Hawat thought. I failed my Duke. Then there was the matter of the traitor. I will live long enough to see her strangled, he thought. I should have killed that Bene Gesserit witch when I had the chance. There was no doubt in his mind who had betrayed them. The Lady Jessica. She fitted all the facts available.
Your man Gurney Halleck and part of his force are safe with our smuggler friends.
Good.
So Gurney will get off this hell planet. We're not all gone. Hawat glanced back at the huddle of his men. They had started the night just past with 300 of his finest. Of those, an even 20 remained, and half of them were wounded. Some of them slept now, standing up, leaning against the rock, sprawled on the sand beneath the rock. Their last thopter, the one they'd been using as a ground effect machine to carry their wounded, had given out just before dawn. They had cut it up with laser guns and hidden the pieces, then worked their way down into this hiding place at the edge of the basin. Hawat had only a rough idea of their location. Some 200 kilometers southeast of Arrakeen. The main travelled ways between the Shield Wall CH communities were somewhere south of them. The Fremen across from Hawat threw back his hood and stillsuit cap to reveal sandy hair and beard. The hair was combed straight back from a high, thin forehead. He had the unreadable total blue eyes of the spice diet. Beard and mustache were stained at one side of the mouth, his hair matted there by pressure of the looping catch tube from his nose plugs. The man removed his plugs, readjusted them. He rubbed at a scar beside his nose.
If you cross the sink here this night, you must not use shields. There is a break in the wall.
He turned on his heels, pointed south.
There, and it is open sand down to the erg. Shields will attract it. Worm. They don't often come in here, but a shield will bring one every time.
He said worm, Hawat thought. He was going to say something else. What? And what does he want of us? Hawat sighed. He could not recall ever before being this tired. It was a muscle weariness that energy pills were unable to ease. Those damnable Sardaukar! With a self-accusing bitterness, he faced the thought of the soldier fanatics and the imperial treachery they represented. His own meant-out assessment of the data told him how little chance he had ever to present evidence of this treachery before the High Council of the Landsraad, where justice might be done.
Do you wish to go to the smugglers?
Is it possible?
The way is long.
Fremen don't like to say no, Idaho had told him once.
You haven't yet told me whether your people can help my wounded.
They are wounded.
The same damned answer every time.
We know they're wounded. That's not the...
Peace, friend. What do your wounded say? Are there those among them who can see the water need of your tribe?
We haven't talked about water.
I can understand your reluctance. They are your friends, your tribesmen. Do you have water?
Not enough.
The Fremen gestured to Hawat's tunic, the skin exposed beneath it.
You were caught in CH without your suits. You must make a water decision, friend.
Can we hire your help?
The Fremen shrugged.
You have no water.
He glanced at the group behind Hawat.
How many of your wounded would you spend?
Hawat fell silent, staring at the man. He could see as a mentat that their communication was out of phase. Word sounds were not being linked up here in the normal manner.
I am Thufir Hawat. I can speak for my duke. I will make promissory commitment now for your help. I wish a limited form of help, preserving my force long enough only to kill a traitor who thinks herself beyond vengeance.
You wish our siding in a vendetta?
The vendetta I'll handle myself. I wish to be freed of responsibility for my wounded, that I may get about it.
The Fremen scowled.
How can you be responsible for your wounded? They are their own responsibility. The water's at issue, Thufir Hawat. Would you have me take that decision away from you?
The man put a hand to a weapon concealed beneath his robe. Hawat tensed, wondering, is there betrayal here?
What do you fear?
These people and their disconcerting directness. Hawat spoke cautiously.
There's a price on my head.
Ah.
The Fremen removed his hand from his weapon.
You think we have the Byzantine corruption. You don't know us. The Harkonnens have not water enough to buy the smallest child among us.
But they had the price of guild passage for more than 2,000 fighting ships, Hawat thought. And the size of that price still staggered him.
We both fight Harkonnens. Should we not share the problems and ways of meeting the battle issue?
We are sharing. I have seen you fight Harkonnens. You are good. There have been times I'd have appreciated your arm beside me.
Say where my arm may help you.
Who knows? There are Harkonnen forces everywhere. But you still have not made the water decision or put it to your wounded.
I must be cautious, Hawat told himself. There's a thing here that's not understood.
Will you show me your way? The Arakeen way.
Stranger thinking.
There was a sneer in the Fremen's tone. He pointed to the northwest, across the cliff top.
We watched you come across the sand last night. You keep your force on the slip face of the dunes. Bad. You have no still suits, no water. You will not last long.
The ways of Arrakis don't come easily.
Truth. But we've killed Harkonnens.
What do you do with your own wounded?
Does a man not know when he is worth saving? Your wounded know you have no water.
He tilted his head, looking sideways up at Hawat.
This is clearly a time for water decision. Both wounded and unwounded must look to the tribe's future.
The tribe's future, Hawat thought. The tribe of Atreides. There's sense in that. He forced himself to the question he had been avoiding.
Have you word of my duke or his son?
Unreadable blue eyes stared upward into Hawat's.
Word?
Their fate!
Fate is the same for everyone. Your duke, it is said, has met his fate. As to the Lisan al-Gaib, his son, that is in Liet's hands. Liet has not said.
I knew the answer without asking, Hawat thought. He glanced back at his men. They were all awake now. They had heard. They were staring out across the sand, the realization in their expressions there was no returning to Caladan for them. And now Arrakis was lost. Hawat turned back to the Fremen.
Have you heard of Duncan, Idaho?
He was in the great house when the shield went down. This I've heard. No more.
She dropped the shield and let in the Harkonnens, he thought. I was the one who sat with my back to a door. How could she do this when it meant turning also against her own son? But who knows how a Bene Gesserit witch thinks, if you can call it thinking. Hawat tried to swallow in a dry throat.
When will you hear about the boy?
We know little of what happens in Arakeen. Who knows?
You have ways of finding out?
perhaps.
The Fremen rubbed at the scar beside his nose.
Tell me, Thufir Hawat, do you have knowledge of the big weapons the Harkonnens used?
The artillery, Hawat thought bitterly. Who could have guessed they'd use artillery in this day of shields?
You refer to the artillery they used to trap our people in the caves. I've theoretical knowledge of such explosive weapons.
Any man who retreats into a cave which has only one opening deserves to die.
Why do you ask about these weapons?
Liet wishes it.
Is that what he wants from us? Hawat wondered.
Did you come here seeking information about the big guns?
Liet wished to see one of the weapons for himself.
Then you should just go take one.
Yes, we took one. We have it hidden where Stilgar can study it for Liet, and where Liet can see it for himself if he wishes. But I doubt he'll want to. The weapon is not a very good one. Poor design for Arrakis.
You took one.
It was a good fight. We lost only 2 men and spilled the water from more than 100 of theirs.
There was Sardaukar at every gun, Hawat thought. This desert madman speaks casually of losing only 2 men against Sardaukar.
We would not have lost the 2 except for those others fighting beside the Harkonnens. Some of those are good fighters.
One of Hawat's men limped forward, looking down at the squatting Fremen.
Are you talking about Sardaukar?
He's talking about Sardaukar.
Sardaukar? Ah, so that's what they are. This was a good night indeed. Sardaukar. Which legion? Do you know?
We don't know.
Sardaukar. Yet they wear Harkonnen clothing. Is that not strange?
The Emperor does not wish it known he fights against a great house.
But you know they are Sardaukar.
Who am I?
You are Thufir Hawat. Well, we would have learned it in time. We've sent 3 of them captive to be questioned by Liet's men.
You captured Sardaukar?
Only 3 of them. They fought well.
If only we'd had the time to link up with these Fremen, Hawat thought. It was a sour lament in his mind. If only we could have trained them and armed them. Great Mother, what a fighting force we'd have had.
Perhaps you delay because of worry over the Lisan al-Gaib. If he is truly the Lisan al-Gaib, harm cannot touch him. Do not spend thoughts on a matter which has not been proved.
I served the Lisan al-Gaib. His welfare is my concern. I've pledged myself to this.
You are pledged to his water?
Hawat glanced at his aide, who was still staring at the Fremen, returned his attention to the squatting figure.
To his water, yes.
You wish to return to Erekeen, to the place of his water?
Yes, to the place of his water.
Why did you not say at first it was a water matter?
The Fremen stood up, seated his nose plugs firmly. Hawat motioned with his head for his aide to return to the others. With a tired shrug, the man obeyed. Hawat heard a low-voiced conversation arise among the men.
There is always a way to water.
Behind Hawat, a man cursed. Hawat's aide called him.
Thufir! Arki just died.
The Fremen put a fist to his ear.
The bond of water. It's a sign.
He stared at Hawat.
We have a place nearby for accepting the water. Shall I call my men?
The aide returned to Hawat's side.
Thufir, a couple of the men left wives in Erekeen. Well, you know how it is at a time like this.
The Fremen still held his fist to his ear.
Is it the bond of water, Thufir Hawat?
Hawat's mind was racing. He sensed now the direction of the Fremen's words, but feared the reaction of the tired men under the rock overhang when they understood it.
The bond of water.
Let our tribes be joined.
The Fremen lowered his fist. As though that were the signal, 4 men slid and dropped down from the rocks above them. They darted back under the overhang, rolled the dead man in the loose robe, lifted him, and began running with him along the cliff wall to the right. Spurts of dust lifted around their running feet. It was over before Howard's tired men could gather their wits. The group, with the body hanging like a sack in its enfolding robe, was gone around a turn in the cliff.
Where are they going with Archie? He was...
They're taking him to bury him.
Fremen don't bury their dead. Don't you try any tricks on us, Thufir. We know what they do. Archie was one of...
Paradise was sure for a man who died in the service of Lisan al-Gaib. If it is the Lisan al-Gaib you serve, as you have said it, why raise mourning cries? The memory of one who died in this fashion will live as long as the memory of man endures.
But Howard's men advanced, angry looks on their faces. One had captured a lasgun. He started to draw it.
Stop right where you are!
Howard fought down the sick fatigue that gripped his muscles.
These people respect our dead. Customs differ, but the meaning's the same.
They're going to render Archie down for his water!
Is it that your men wish to attend the ceremony?
He doesn't even see the problem, Howard thought. The naivete of the Fremen was frightening.
They're concerned for a respected comrade.
We will treat your comrade with the same reverence we treat our own. This is the bond of water. We know the rights. A man's flesh is his own. The water belongs to the tribe.
Howard spoke quickly as the man with the lasgun advanced another step.
Will you now help our wounded?
One does not question the bond. We will do for you what a tribe does for its own. First, we must get all of you suited and see to the necessities.
The man with the lasgun hesitated. Howard's aide spoke.
Are we buying help with Archie's water?
Not buying. We've joined these people.
Customs differ.
Howard began to relax.
And they'll help us get to Arakeen?
We will kill Harkonnens and Sardaukar.
The Fremen grinned. He stepped backward, cupped his hands beside his ears, and tipped his head back, listening. Presently he lowered his hands.
An aircraft comes. Conceal yourselves beneath the rock and remain motionless.
At a gesture from Howard, his men obeyed. The Fremen took Howard's arm, pressed him back with the others.
We will fight in the time of fighting.
He reached beneath his robes, brought out a small cage, lifted a creature from it. Howard recognized a tiny bat. The bat turned its head, and Howard saw its blue-within-blue eyes. The Fremen stroked the bat, soothing it, crooning to it. He bent over the animal's head, allowed a drop of saliva to fall from his tongue into the bat's upturned mouth. The bat stretched its wings but remained on the Fremen's opened hand. The man took a tiny tube, held it beside the bat's head and chattered into the tube. Then, lifting the creature high, he threw it upward. The bat swooped away beside the cliff and was lost to sight. The Fremen folded the cage, thrust it beneath his robe. Again he bent his head, listening.
They quarter the high country. One wonders who they seek up there.
It's known that we retreated in this direction.
One should never presume one is the sole object of a hunt. Watch the other side of the basin. You will see a thing.
Time passed. Some of Howard's men stirred, whispering. "Remain silent as frightened animals," the Fremen hissed. Howard discerned movement near the opposite cliff, flitting blurs of tan on tan. "My little friend carried his message," the Fremen said. "He is a good messenger, day or night. I'll be unhappy to lose that one." The movement across the sink faded away. On the entire 4 to 5 kilometer expanse of sand, nothing remained but the growing pressure of the day's heat-blurred columns of rising air. "Be most silent now," the Fremen whispered. A file of plodding figures emerged from a break in the opposite cliff, headed directly across the sink. To Howard they appeared to be Fremen, but a curiously inept band. He counted 6 men making heavy going of it over the dunes. A thwack-thwack of ornithopter wings sounded high to the right, behind Howard's group. The craft came over the cliff wall above them. An Atreides thopter with Harkonnen battle colours splashed on it. The thopter swooped toward the men crossing the sink. The group there stopped on a dune crest, waved. The thopter circled once over them in a tight curve, came back for a dust-shrouded landing in front of the Fremen. 5 men swarmed from the thopter, and Howard saw the dust-repellent shimmering of shields, and in their motions the hard competence of Sardaukar.
Aye! They used their stupid shields!
The Fremen beside Howard hissed. He glanced toward the open south wall of the sink.
They are Sardaukar,
Howard whispered.
Good.
The Sardaukar approached the waiting group of Fremen in an enclosing half-circle. Sun glinted on blades held ready. The Fremen stood in a compact group, apparently indifferent. Abruptly, the sand around the two groups sprouted Fremen. They were at the ornithopter, then in it. Where the two groups had met at the dune crest, a dust cloud partly obscured violent motion. Presently, dust settled. Only Fremen remained standing.
They left only 3 men in their thopter, the Fremen beside Howard said. That was fortunate. I don't believe we had to damage the craft in taking it.
Behind Howard, one of his men whispered,
Those were Sardaukar. Did you notice how well they fought?
The Fremen asked. Howard took a deep breath. He smelled the burned dust around him, felt the heat, the dryness. In a voice to match that dryness, he said,
Yes, they fought well indeed.
The captured thopter took off with a lurching flap of wings, angled upward to the south in a steep, wing-tucked climb.
So these Fremen can handle thopters too,
Howard thought. On the distant dune, a Fremen waved a square of green cloth, once, twice.
More come, the Fremen beside Howard barked. Be ready. I'd hoped to have us away without more inconvenience.
Inconvenience, Howard thought. He saw 2 more thopters swooping from high in the west onto an area of sand suddenly devoid of visible Fremen. Only 8 splotches of blue, the bodies of the Sardaukar in Harkonnen uniforms, remained at the scene of violence. Another thopter glided in over the cliff wall above Howard. He drew in a sharp breath as he saw it, a big troop carrier. It flew with the slow spread wing heaviness of a full load, like a giant bird coming to its nest. In the distance, the purple finger of a lasgun beam flicked from one of the diving thopters. It laced across the sand, raising a sharp trail of dust.
The cowards!
The Fremen beside Howard rasped. The troop carrier settled toward the patch of blue-clad bodies. Its wings crept out to full reach, began the cupping action of a quick stop. Howard's attention was caught by a flash of sun on metal to the south. A thopter plummeting there in a power dive, wings folded flat against its sides, its jets a golden flare against the dark silvered grey of the sky. It plunged like an arrow toward the troop carrier, which was unshielded because of the lasgun activity around it. Straight into the carrier, the diving thopter plunged. A flaming roar shook the basin. Rocks tumbled from the cliff walls all around. A geyser of red-orange shot skyward from the sand where the carrier and its companion thopters had been. Everything there caught in the flame. It was a Fremen who took off in that captured thopter, Howard thought. He deliberately sacrificed himself to get that carrier.
Great Mother, what are these Fremen?
A reasonable exchange, said the Fremen beside Howard.
There must have been 300 men in that carrier. Now, we must see to their water and make plans to get another aircraft.
He started to step out of their rock-shadowed concealment. A rain of blue uniforms came over the cliff wall in front of him, falling in low suspensor slowness. In the flashing instant, Howard had time to see that they were Sardaukar. Hard faces set in battle frenzy, that they were unshielded and each carried a knife in one hand, a stunner in the other. A thrown knife caught Howard's Fremen companion in the throat, hurling him backward, twisting face down. Howard had only time to draw his own knife before blackness of a stunner projectile felled him.